Space Viking by H. Beampiper, Part 2, The Big Board. So Andray Dunnan was haunting him again. Tiny bits of information came in. Dunnan's ship had been on Hoth, on Nurgle, selling loot. Now he sold for gold or platinum and bought little, usually arms and ammunition. Apparently his base, wherever it was fully self-sufficient. It was certain, too, that Dunnan knew he was being hunted. One Space Viking who had talked with him quoted him as saying, "I don't want any trouble with Trask, and if he's smart, he won't look for any with me." This made him all the more positive that somewhere Dunnan was building strength for an attack on Tanith. He made it a rule that there should always be at least 2 ships in orbit off Tanith in addition to the Lamia, which was on permanent patrol, and he installed more missile launching stations both on the Mu and on the planet. There were 3 ships bearing the ward's swords and atom symbol, and a 4th building on Graham. Count Lionel of New Haven was building one of his own, and 3 big freighters shuttled across the 3,000 light-years between Tanith and Graham. Cesar Karvall, who had never recovered from his wounds, had died. Lady Lavina had turned the barony and the business over to her brother, Bert Sandrassen, and gone to live on Ixcal. Ibur, the shipyard at Rivington, was finished, and now they had built the landing legs of Harkamen's Coruscant Roman II, and were putting up the skeleton. And they were trading with Amaterasu now. Pedros and Pedro had been overthrown and put to death by General Dagro Ector during the disorders following the looting of Eglansby. The troops left behind in Stalgoland had mutinied and made common cause with their late enemies. The two nations were in an uneasy alliance, with several other nations combining against them, when the Nemesis and the Space Scourge returned and declared peace against the whole planet. There was no fighting. Everybody knew what had happened to Stalgoland and Eglansby. In the end, all the governments of Amaterasu joined in a loose agreement to get the mines reopened and resume production of gadolinium, and to share in the fissionables being imported. In exchange, it had been harder and had taken a year longer to do business with Beowulf. The Beowulfers had a single planetary government, and they were inclined to shoot first and negotiate afterward, a natural enough attitude in view of experiences of the past. However, they had enough old Federation period textbooks still in microprint to know what could be done with gadolinium. They decided to write off the past as fair fi, and no bad blood, and start over again. It would be some years before either planet had hyperships of their own. In the meantime, both were good customers and rapidly becoming good friends. A number of young Amaterasuans and Beowulfers had come to Tanith to study various technologies. The Tanith locals were studying, too. In the first year, Trask had gathered the more intelligent boys of 10 to 12 from each community and begun teaching them. In the past year, he had sent the most intelligent of them off to Graham to school. In another 5 years, they'd be coming home to teach. In the meantime, he was bringing teachers to Tanith from Graham. There was a school at Tradetown and others in some of the larger villages, and at Rivington there was something that could almost be called a college. In another 10 years or so, Tanith would be able to pretend to the status of civilization. If only Andray Dunnan and his ships didn't come too soon. They would be beaten off, he was confident of that, but the damage Tanith would take in the defense would set back his work for years. He knew all too well what Space Viking ships could do to a planet. He'd have to find Dunnan's base, smash it, destroy his ships, kill the man himself first. Not to avenge that murder 6 years ago on Graham. That was long ago and far away. And Elaine was vanished, and so was the Lucas Trask who had loved and lost her. What mattered now was planting and nurturing civilization on Tanith. But where would he find Dunnan in 200 billion cubic light-years? Dunnan had no such problem. He knew where his enemy was, and Dunnan was gathering strength. The yo-yo, Captain Van Humfort. She had been reported twice, once in company with the Starhopper, and once with the Enterprise. She bore a blazon of a feminine hand dangling a planet by a string from one finger, a good ship, and an able, ruthless captain. The Ball-eyed, she and the Enterprise had made a raid on Ithun. The Gilgameshires had settled there, and one of their ships had brought that story in, and he recruited 2 ships at once on Melkarth, and there was a good deal of mirth about that among the Tanith Space Vikings. Melkarth was strictly a poultry planny. Its people had sunk to the village peasant level. They had no wealth worth taking or carrying away. It was, however, a place where a ship could be set down, and there were women, and the locals had not lost the art of distillation and made potent liquors. A crew could have fun there, much less expensively than on a regular Viking base planet. And for the last 8 years, a Captain Niall Burrick of the Fortuna had been occupying it, taking his ship out for occasional quick raids and spending most of the time living from day to day almost on the local level. Once in a while, a Gilgameshire would come in to see if he had anything to trade. It was a Gilgameshire who brought the story to Tanith, and it was almost 2 years old when he told it. We heard it from the people of the planet, the ones who live where Burrick had his base. First, there was a trading ship came in. You may have heard of her. She is the one called the Honest Horiz. Trask laughed at that. Her captain, Horiz Sastroff, called himself Honest Horiz, a misnomer which he had also bestowed on his ship. He was a trader of sorts. Even the Gilgameshires despised him, and not even a Gilgameshire would have taken a wretched craft like the Honest Horiz to space. He had been to Melkarth before, the Gilgameshire said. He and Burrick are friends. He pronounced that like a final and damning judgment of both of them. The story the locals told our brethren of the fair dealer was that the Honest Horiz was landed beside Burrick's ship for 10 days, when 2 other ships came in. They said one had the blue crescent badge, and the other bore a green monster leaping from one star to another. The Enterprise and the Starhopper. He wondered why they'd gone to a planet like Melkarth. Maybe they knew in advance whom they'd find there. The locals thought there would be fighting, but there was not. There was a great feast of all 4 crews. Then everything of value was loaded aboard the Fortuna, and all 4 ships lifted and spaced out together. They said Burrick left nothing of any worth whatever behind. They were much disappointed at that. Have any of them been back since? All 3 Gilgameshires, captain, exec, and priest, shook their heads. Captain Gurash of the fair dealer said it had been over a year before his ship put in there. He could still see where the landing legs of the ships had pressed into the ground, but the locals said they had not been back. That made 2 more ships about which inquiries must be made. He wondered for a moment why in Gehenna Dunnan would want ships like that. They must make the Space Scourge and the Lamia as he had first seen them look like units of the Royal Navy of Excalibur. Then he became frightened, with an irrational retrospective fright at what might have happened. It could have, too, at any time in the last year and a half. Either or both of those ships could have come in on Tanith completely unsuspected. It was only by the sheerest accident that he had found out, even now, about them. Everybody else thought it was a huge joke. They thought it would be a bigger joke if Dunnan sent those ships to Tanith now when they were warned and ready for them. There were other things to worry about. One was the altering attitude of His Majesty Angus I. When the Space Scourge returned, the newly titled Baron Valkenhayn brought with him, along with the princely title and the commission as Viceroy of Tanith, a most cordial personal audiovisual greeting, warm and friendly. Angus had made it seated at his desk, bareheaded and smoking a cigarette. The one which had come on the next ship out was just as cordial, but the king was not smoking and wore a small gold-circled cap of maintenance. By the time they had 3 ships in service on scheduled 3-month arrivals, a year and a half later, he was speaking from his throne, wearing his crown and employing the first-person plural for himself, and finally the third-person singular for Trask. By the end of the 4th year, there was no audiovisual message from him in person, and a stiff complaint from Ravard Groffies to the effect that His Majesty felt it unseemly for a subject to address his sovereign while seated, even by audiovisual. This was accompanied by a rather apologetic personal message from Groffies, now Prime Minister, to the effect that His Majesty felt compelled to stand on his royal dignity at all times. That, after all, there was a difference between the position and dignity of the Duke of Wardshaven and that of the planetary King of Graham. Prince Trask of Tanith couldn't quite see it. The king was simply the first nobleman of the planet. Even kings like Rodolph of Excalibur or Napoleon of Flamberge didn't try to be anything more. Thereafter, he addressed his greetings and reports to the Prime Minister, always with a personal message, too. Which Groffes replied in kind. Not only the form, but also the content of the messages from Graham underwent change. His Majesty was most dissatisfied. His Majesty was deeply disappointed. His Majesty felt that His Majesty's colonial realm of Tanith was not contributing sufficiently to the royal exchequer. And His Majesty felt that Prince Trask was placing entirely too much emphasis upon trade and not enough upon raiding. After all, why barter with barbarians when it was possible to take what you wanted from them by force? And there was the matter of the Blue Comet, Count Lionel of New Haven's ship. His Majesty was most displeased that the Count of New Haven was trading with Tanith from his own spaceport. All goods from Tanith should pass through the Wardshaven spaceport. Look, Ravard, he told the audiovisual camera which was recording his reply to Groffes. You saw the space scourge when she came in, didn't you? That's what happens to a ship that raids a planet where there's anything worth taking. Beowulf is lousy with fissionables. They'll give us all the plutonium we can load in exchange for gadolinium, which we sell them at about twice Sword World prices. We trade plutonium on Amaterasu for gadolinium and get it for about half Sword World prices. He pressed the stop button until he could remember the ancient formula. You may quote me as saying that whoever has advised His Majesty that that isn't good business is no friend to His Majesty or to the realm. As for the complaint about the Blue Comet, as long as she is owned and operated by the Count of New Haven, who is a stockholder in the Tanith adventure, she has every right to trade here. He wondered why His Majesty didn't stop Lionel of New Haven from sending the Blue Comet out from Graham. He found out from her skipper the next time she came in. He doesn't dare, that's why. He's king as long as the great lords like Count Lionel and Joris of Bigelasport and Alan of Northport want him to be. Count Lionel has more men and more guns and contragravity than he has now, and that's without the help he'd get from everybody else. Everything's quiet on Graham now. Even the war on South Main Continent stopped. Everybody wants to keep it that way. Even King Angus isn't crazy enough to do anything to start a war. Not yet, anyhow. Not yet. The captain of the Blue Comet, who was one of Count Lionel's vassal barons, was silent for a moment. You ought to know, Prince Trask, he said. Andray Dunnan's grandmother was the king's mother. Her father was old Barons Arvas of Blackcliff. He was what was called an invalid, the last 20 years of his life. He was always attended by 2 male nurses about the size of Otto Harkaman. He was also said to be slightly eccentric. The unfortunate grandfather of Duke Angus had always been a subject nice people avoided. The unfortunate grandfather of King Angus was probably a subject everybody who valued their necks avoided. Lothar F.A. Il had also come out on the Blue Comet. He was just as outspoken. I'm not going back. I'm transferring most of the funds of the Bank of Wardshaven out here. From now on, it'll be a branch of the Bank of Tanith. This is where the business is being done. It's getting impossible to do business at all in Wardshaven. What little business there is to do. Just what's been happening? Well, taxation first. It seems the more money came in. From here, the higher taxes got on Graham. Discriminatory taxes, too, pinched the small landholding and industrial barons and favored a few big ones. Baron Spasso and his crowd. Baron Spasso, now? F. nodded. Of about half of Glasspythe. A lot of the Glasspythe barons lost their baronies, some of them their heads, after Duke Omfrey was run out. It seems there was a plot against the life of His Majesty. It was exposed by the zeal and vigilance of Sir Garvan Spasso, who was elevated to the peerage and rewarded with the lands of the conspirators. You said business was bad as business? F. nodded again. The big Tanith boom has busted. It got oversold, everybody wanted in on it. And they should never have built those 2 last ships, the Speedwell and the Good Hope. The return on them didn't justify it. Then you're creating your own industries and building you own equipment and armament here. That's caused a slump in industry on Graham. I'm glad Lavina Karvall has enough money invested to live on. And finally, the consumer's goods market is getting flooded with stuff that's coming in from here and competing with Graham industry. Well, that was understandable. One of the ships that made the shuttle trip to Graham would carry enough in her strong rooms, in gold and jewels and the like, to pay a handsome profit on the voyage. The bulk goods that went into the cargo holds was practically taking a free ride, so anything on hand, stuff that nobody would ordinarily think of shipping in interstellar trade, went aboard. A 2,000-foot freighter had a great deal of cargo space. Baron Trask of Traskin hadn't even begun to realize what Tanith base was going to cost Graham. As might be expected, the Beowulfers finished their hypership. Erst, they had started with everything but a little know-how which had been quickly learned. Amaterasu had to begin by creating the industry. They needed to create the industry. They needed to build a ship. The Beowulf ship, she was named Viking's Gift, came in on Tanith 5.5 years after the Nemesis, and the Space Scourge had raided Beowulf. Her skipper had fought a normal drive ship in that battle, beside plutonium and radioactive isotopes. She carried a general cargo of the sort of luxury goods unique to Beowulf, which could always find a market in interstellar trade. After selling the cargo and depositing the money in the Bank of Tanith, the skipper of the Viking's Gift wanted to know where he could find a good planet to raid. They gave him a list, none too tough, but all slightly above the chicken-stealing level, and another list of planets he was ought to raid, planets with which Tanith was trading. 6 months later they learned that he had showed up on Kepra, with which they were now trading, and had flooded the market there with plundered textiles, hardware, ceramics, and plastics. He had bought Craig meat and hides. "You see what you did now?" Harkaman clamored. "You thought you were making a customer. What you made was a competitor." "What I made was an ally. If we ever do find Dunnan's planet, we'll need a fleet to take it. A couple of Beowulf ships would help. You know them. You fought them, too." Harkaman had other worries. While cruising in Coruscant Roman II, he had come in on Vithar, one of the planets where Tanith ships traded, to find it being raided by a Space Viking ship based on Xochitl. He had fought a short but furious ship action, battering the invader until he was glad to hyper out. And he had gone directly to Xochitl, arriving on the heels of the ship he had beaten, and had it out both with the captain and Prince Victor, serving them with an ultimatum to leave Tanith trade planets alone in the future. "How did they take it?" Trask asked, when he returned to report. "Just about the way you would have. Victor said his people were Space Vikings, not Gilgameshers. I told him we weren't Gilgameshers either, as he'd fie. Out on Xochitl the next time one of his ships raided one of our planets. Are you going to back me up? Of course, you can always send Prince Victor my head and an apology. If I have to send him anything, I'll send him a sky full of ships and a planet full of hellburners. You did perfectly right, Otto. Exactly what I'd have done in your place." There the matter rested. There were no more raids by Xochitl ships on any of their trade planets. No mention of the incident was made in any of the reports sent back to Graham. The Graham situation was deteriorating rapidly enough. Finally, there was an audiovisual message from Angus himself. He was seated on his throne, wearing his crown, and he began speaking from the screen abruptly. "We, Angus, King of Graham and Tanith, are highly displeased with our subject, Lucas, Prince and Viceroy of Tanith. We are ourselves very badly served by Prince Trask. We therefore command him to return to Graham and render to us account of his administration of our colony and realm of Tanith." After some hasty preparations, Trask recorded a reply. He was sitting on a throne himself, and he wore a crown just as ornate as King Angus and robes of white and black Imhotep furs. "We, Lucas, Prince of Tanith," he began, "are quite willing to acknowledge the suzerainty of the King of Graham, formerly Duke of Wardshaven. It is our earnest desire, if possible, to remain at peace and friendship with the King of Graham, and to carry on trade relations with him and with his subjects. We must, however, reject absolutely any efforts on his part to dictate the internal policies of our realm of Tanith. It is our earnest hope," damn it, he'd said earnest. He should have thought of some other word, "that no act on the part of His Majesty the King of Graham will create any breach in the friendship existing between his realm and ours." 3 months later, the next ship, which had left Graham while King Angus' summons was still in hyperspace, brought Baron Rathmore. Shaking hands with him as he left the landing craft, Trask wanted to know if he'd been sent out as the new viceroy. Rathmore started to laugh and ended by sing vilely. "No, I've come out to offer my sword to the King of Tanith," he said. "Prince of Tanith for the time being," Trask corrected. "The sword, however, is most acceptable. I take it you've had all of our blessed sovereign you can stomach." "Lucas, you have enough ships and men here to take Graham," Rathmore said. Proclaim yourself king of Tanith and then lay claim to the throne of Graham and the whole planet would rise for you. Rathmore had lowered his voice, but even so the open landing stage was no place for this sort of talk. He said so, ordered a couple of the locals to collect Rathmore's luggage, and got him into a hall car, taking him down to his living quarters. After they were in private, Rathmore began again. It's more than anybody can stand. There isn't one of the old great nobility he hasn't alienated, or one of the minor barons, the land. Olders and industrialists, the people who were always the backbone of Graham. And it goes from them down to the common folk. Assessments on the lords, taxes on the people, inflation to meet the taxes, high prices, debased coinage. Everybody's being beggared except this rabble of new lords he has around him and that slut of a wife and her greedy kinfolk. Trask stiffened. You're not speaking of Queen Flavia, are you? He asked softly. Rathmore's mouth opened slightly. Great Satan, don't you know? No, of course not. The news would have come on the same ship I did. Why Angus divorced Flavia. He claimed that she was incapable of giving him an heir to the throne. He remarried immediately. The girl's name meant nothing to Trask. He did know of her father, a Baron Valdeva. He was lord of a small estate south of the Ward lands and west of New Haven. Most of his people were out-and-out bandits and cattle rustlers, and he was as close to being one himself as he could get. Nice family he's married into. A credit to the dignity of the throne. Yes, you wouldn't know this Lady Demoiselle Evita. She was only 17 when you left Graham and hadn't begun to acquire a reputation outside her father's lands. She's made up for lost time since, though. And she has enough uncles and aunts and cousins and ex-lovers and whatnot to fill out an infantry regiment, and every one of them's at court with both hands out to grab everything they can. How does Duke Joris like this? The Duke of Bigelasport was Queen Flavia's brother. I dare say he's less than delighted. He's hiring mercenaries, is what he's doing, and buying combat contragravity. Lucas, why don't you come back? You have no idea what a reputation you have on Graham. Now, everybody would rally to you. He shook his head. I have a throne here on Tanith. On Graham I want nothing. I'm sorry for the way Angus turned out. I thought he'd make a good king. But since he's made an intolerable king, the lords and people of Graham will have to get rid of him for themselves. I have my own tasks here. Rathmore shrugged. I was afraid that would be it, he said. Well, I offered my sword. I won't take it back. I can help you in what you're doing on Tanith. The captain of the Free Space Viking damn thing was named Roger Fanmorval Estherson, which meant that he was some sword-worlder's acknowledged bastard by a woman of one of the old Federation planets. His mother's people could have been Nergalers. He had coarse black hair, a mahogany-brown skin, and red-brown, almost maroon, eyes. He tasted the wine the robot poured for him and expressed appreciation, then began unwrapping the parcel he had brought in. Something I found while raiding on Tetragrammaton, he said. I thought you might like to have it. It was made on Graham. It was an automatic pistol with a belt and holster. The leather was bisonoid hide. The buckle of the belt was an oval enameled with a crescent, pale blue on black. The pistol was a plain 10mm military model with grooved plastic grips on the receiver at ball, with a stamp of the House of Hoylbar, the firearms manufacturers of Glaspythe. Evidently it was one of the arms Duke Omfrey had provided for Andray Dunnan's original mercenary company. Tetragrammaton? He glanced over to the big board. There was no previous report from that planet. How long ago? I'd say about 300 hours. I came from there directly, less than 250 hours. Dunnan's ships had left the planet 3 days before I got there. That was practically sizzling hot. Well, something like that had to happen sooner or later. The Space Viking was asking him if he knew what sort of place Tetragrammaton was. Neo-barbarian, trying to recivilize in a crude way. Small population, concentrated on one continent, farming and fisheries. A little heavy industry in a small way at a couple of towns. They had some nuclear. Introduced a century or so ago by traders from Marduk, one of the really civilized planets. They still depended on Marduk for fissionables. Their export product was an abominably smelling vegetable oil which furnished the base for delicate perfumes, and which nobody was ever able to synthesize properly. I heard they had steel mills in operation now, the half-breed Space Viking said. It seems that somebody on Rimmen has just reinvented the railroad, and they need more steel than they can produce for themselves. I thought I'd raid Tetragrammaton for steel and trade it on Rimmon for a load of heaven tea. When I got there, though, the whole planet was in a mess, not raiding, but plain wanton destruction. The locals were just digging themselves out of it when I landed. Some of them, who didn't think they had anything at all left to lose, gave me a fight. I captured a few of them to find out what had happened. One of them had that pistol. He said he'd taken it off a Space Viking he'd killed. The ships that raided them were the Enterprise and the Yo-Yo. I knew you'd want to hear about it. I got some of the locals' stories on tape. Well, thank you. I'll want to hear those tapes. Now you say you want steel? Well, I haven't any money. That's why I was going to raid Tet. Regrammaton? Niflheim with the money. Your cargo's paid for already. This, he said, touching the pistol, and whatever's on the tapes. Dealing with Roger Fanmorval Estherson, they played off the tapes that evening. They weren't particularly informative. The locals who had been interrogated hadn't been in actual contact with Dunnan's people except in combat. The man who had been carrying the 10mm Hoyle bar was the best witness of the lot, and he knew little. He had caught one of them alone, shot him from behind with a shotgun, taken his pistol, and then gotten away as quickly as he could. They had sent down landing craft, it seemed, and said they wanted to trade. Then something must have happened, nobody knew what, and they had begun a massacre and sacked the town. After returning to their ships, they had opened fire with nuclear missiles. Sounds like Dunnan, Hugh Rathmore said in disgust. He just went kill crazy, the bad blood of Blackcliff. There are funny things about this, Boke Valkenhayn said. I'd say it was a terror raid, but who in Gehenna was he trying to terrorize? I wondered about that, too. Harkaman frowned. This town where he landed seems, such as it was, to have been the planetary capital. They just landed, pretending friendship, which I can't see why they needed to pretend, and then began ooting and massacring. There wasn't anything of real value there. All they took was what the men could carry themselves or stuff into their landing craft, and they did that, because they have what amounts to a religious taboo against landing anywhere and leaving without stealing something. The real loot was at these two other towns, a steel mill and big stocks of steel at one and all that skunk apple oil at the other. So what did they do? They dropped a Ive Megaton bomb on each one and blew both of them to MC Square. That was a terror raid pure and simple, but as Boke inquires, just who were they terrorizing? If there were big cities somewhere else on the planet, it would figure, but there aren't. They blew out the two biggest cities and all the loot in them. Then they wanted to terrorize somebody off the planet. But nobody'd hear about it off-planet, somebody protested. The Marju. Kans would, they trade with Tetragrammaton, the acknowledged bastard of somebody named Morville said. They have a couple of ships a year there. That's right, Trask agreed. Marduk? You mean you think Dunnan's trying to terrorize Marduk? Valkenhayn demanded. Great Satan, even he isn't crazy enough for that. Baron Rathmore started to say something about what Andray Dunnan was crazy enough to do and what his uncle was crazy enough to do. It was just one of the cracks he had been making since he'd come to Tanith and didn't have to look over his shoulder while he was making them. I think he is too, Trask said. I think that is exactly what he is doing. Don't ask me why, as Otto is fond of remarking, he's crazy and we aren't, and that gives him an advantage. But what have we gotten, since those Gilgameshires told us about his picking up Burrick's ship and the honest whore is? Until today, we've heard nothing from any other Space Viking. What we have gotten was stories from Gilgameshires about raids on planets where they trade, and every one of them is also a planet where Marduk's ships trade. And in every case, there has been little or nothing reported about valuable loot taken. The stories are all about wanton and murderous bombings. I think Andray Dunnan is making war on Marduk. Then he's crazier than his grandfather and his uncle both, Rathmore cried. You mean he's making a string of terror raids on their trade planets, hoping to pull the Marjukan space navy away from the home planet? Harkaman had stopped being incredulous. And when he gets them all lured away, he'll make a fast raid. That's what I think. Remember our fundamental postulate, Dunnan is crazy. Remember how he convinced himself that he was the rightful heir to the ducal crown of Wardshaven. And remember his insane passion for Elaine. He pushed that thought hastily from him. Now, he's convinced that he's the greatest Space Viking in history. He has to do something worthy of that distinction. When was the last time anybody attacked a civilized planet? I don't mean Gilgamesh, I mean a planet like Marduk. 120 years ago, Prince Havelgar of Haw. Tekler 6 ships against a tone. 2 ships got back. He didn't. Nobody's tried it since, Harkonnen said, so Dunnan the Great will do it. I hope he tries, he surprised himself by adding. That's provided I find out what happened, then I could stop thinking about him. There was a time when he had dreaded the possibility that somebody else might kill Dunnan before he could. Seshat, Abadicut, Lugaluru, Audhumla, the young man. Elevated by his father's death in the Dunnan raid to the post of hereditary president of the Democratic Republic of Tetragrammaton, had been sure that the Marduk ships which came to his planet traded also on those. There had been some difficulty about making contact, and the first face-to-face meeting had begun in an atmosphere of bitter distrust on his part. They had met out of doors, around them, spread wrecked and burned buildings and hastily constructed huts and shelters and wide spaces of charred and slagged rubble. They blew up the steel mill here and the oil refinery at Jansborough. They bombed and strafed the little farm towns and villages. They scattered radioactives that killed as many as the bombing, and after they had gone away, this other ship came. The damn thing. She bore the head of a beast with 3 very big horns. That's the one. They did a little damage at first. When the captain found out what had happened to us, he left some food and medicines for us. Roger Fanmorval Estherson hadn't mentioned that. Well, we'd like to help you if we can. Do you have nuclear power? We can give you a little equipment. Just remember it of us when you're back on your feet. We'll be back to trade later, but don't think you owe us anything. The man who did this to you is my enemy. Now I want to talk to every one of your people who can tell me anything at all. Seshat was the closest. They went there first. They were too late. Seshat had had it already, and on the evidence of the radioactivity counters not too long ago. 400 hours at most. There had been 2 hellburners. The cities on which they had fallen were still smoking pits literally burned into the ground and the bedrock below at the center of 500-mile radii. I have slag and lava and scorched earth and burned forests. There had been a planet buster. It had started a major earthquake, and 6 thermonuclears. There were probably quite a few survivors. A human planetary population is extremely hard to exterminate completely, but within a century, they'd be back to the loincloth and the stone hatchet. We don't even know Dunnan did it, personally, Patrick Moreland said. For all we know, he's down in an airtight cave city on some planet nobody ever heard of, sitting on a golden throne, surrounded by a harem. He had begun to suspect that Dunnan was doing something of just the sort. The greatest space Viking of history would naturally found a space Viking empire. An emperor goes out to look his empire over now and then. I don't spend all my time on Tanith. Say we try Audhumla next. It's the farthest away. We might get there while he's still shooting up Abadicut and Lugaluru. Gwat, figure us a jump for it. When the colored turbulence washed away and the screen cleared, Audhumla looked like Tanith or Kepra or Amaterasu or any other Terra-type planet. A big disk brilliant with reflected sunlight, and glowing with starlit and moonlit atmosphere on the other. There was a single rather large moon and, in the telescopic screen, the usual markings of seas and continents and rivers and mountain ranges. But there was nothing to show. Oh yes, lights on the darkened side, and from the size they must be vast cities. All the available data for Audhumla was long out of date. A considerable civilization must have developed in the last 6 centuries. Another light appeared, a hard blue-white spark that spread into a larger, less brilliant yellow light. At the same time, all the alarm devices in the command room went into a pandemonium of jangling and flashing and squawking and howling and shouting. Radiation, energy release, contragravity distortion effects, infrared output, a welter of indecipherable radio and communication screen signals, radar and scan array beams from the planet. Trask's fist began hurting. He found that he had been pounding the desk in front of him with it. He stopped it. We caught him, he was yelling hoarsely. Full speed in, continuous acceleration as much as we can stand. We'll worry about decelerating when we're in shooting distance. The planet grew steadily larger. Carford was taking him at his word about continuous acceleration. There'd be a Gehenna of a bill to pay when they started decelerating. On the planet, more bombs were going off just outside atmosphere beyond the sunset line. Ship observed. Altitude about 100 to 500 miles, hundreds, not thousands, 35 degrees north latitude, 15 degrees west of the sunset line. Ship is under fire, bomb explosions near her. A voice whooped. Somebody else was yelling that the city lights were really burning cities or burning forests. The first voice, having stopped, broke in again. Ship is visible in telescopic screen just at the sunset line. And there's another ship detected but not visible, somewhere around the equator, and a third one somewhere out of sight. We can just get the fringe of her contragravity field around the planet. That meant there were two sides and a fight, unless Dunnan had picked up a third ship somewhere. The telescopic view shifted. For a moment the planet was completely off-screen, and then its curvature came in. The screen against a star-scattered background. They were almost into 2,000 miles now. Karvall was yelling to stop acceleration and trying to put the ship into a spiral orbit. Suddenly they caught a glimpse of one of the ships. She's in trouble. That was Paul Koreff's voice. She's leaking air and water vapor like crazy. Well, is she a good guy or a bad guy? Morland was yelling back, as though Koreff's spectroscopes could distinguish. Koreff ignored that. Another ship making signal, he said. She's the one coming up over the equator. Sword World impulse code, her communication screen combination, and an identify yourself. Karvall punched out the combination as Koreff furnished it. While Trask was desperately willing his face into a mobility, the screen lighted. It wasn't Andray Dunnan. That was a disappointment. It was almost as good, though. His Inchman, Sir Neville Orme. Well, Sir Neville, a pleasant surprise, he heard himself saying. We last met on the terrace at Karvall House, did we not? For once, the paper-white face of Andray Dunnan's aim damné showed expression, but whether it was fear, surprise, shock, hatred, anger, or what combination of them, Trask could no more than guess. Trask, Satan curse you. Then the screen went blank. In the telescopic screen, the other ship came on unfalteringly. Paul Koreff, who had gotten more data on mass, engine energy output, and dimensions, was identifying her as the Enterprise. Well, go for her. Give her everything? They didn't need the order. Van Larch was speaking rapidly into his handphone, and Alvin Karvall was hurling his voice all over the Nemesis, warning of sudden deceleration and direction change. And while he was speaking, things in the manned room began sliding. In the telescopic screen, the other ship was plainly visible. He could see the oval patch of black with the blue crescent, and in his screen Dunnan would be seeing the sword-impaled skull of the Nemesis. If only he could be sure Dunnan was there to see it. If it had only been Dunnan's face instead of Orme's that he had seen in the screen. As it was, he couldn't be sure, and if one of the missiles that were already going but made a lucky hit, he might never be sure. He didn't care who killed Dunnan or how. All he wanted was to know that Dunnan's death had set him free from a self-assumed obligation that was now meaningless to him. The Enterprise launched counter-missiles, so did the Nemesis. There were momentarily unbearable flashes of pure energy, and from them globes of incandescence spread and vanished. Something must have gotten through. Red lights flashed on. Damage board. It had been something heavy enough even to jolt the huge mass of the Nemesis. At the same time, the other ship took a hit from something that would have vaporized her had she not been armored in collapsium. Then, as they passed close together, guns hammered back and forth along with missiles, and then the Enterprise was out of sight around the horizon. Another ship, the size of Otto Harkamen's Coruscant Roman II, was approaching. She or a tapering, red-nailed feminine hand dangling a planet by a string. They rushed toward each other, planting a garden of evanescent fire flowers between them. They pounded one another with guns, and then they sped apart. At the same time, Paul Koreff was picking up an impulse code signal from the third, crippled, ship, a screen combination. Trask punched it out as he received it. A man in space armor was looking out of the screen. That was bad if they had to suit up in the command room. They still had air. His helmet was off, but it was attached and hinged back. On his breastplate was a device of a dragon-like beast perched with its tail around a planet and a crown above. He had a thin, high-cheeked face with a vertical wrinkle between his eyes and a clipped blonde mustache. Who are you, stranger? You're fighting my enemies. Does that make you a friend? I'm a friend of anybody who owns Andray Dunnan, his enemy. Sword World ship Nemesis. I'm Prince Lucas Trask of Tanith, commanding. Royal Marjukan ship Victrix. The thin-faced man gave a wry laugh. Not been living up to her name so well. I'm Prince Simon Bentrick, commanding. Are you still battle-worthy? We can fire about half our guns. We still have a few missiles left. 70% of the ship's sealed off, and we've been holding dozen places. We have power enough for lift and some steering way. We can't make lateral way except at the expense of lift, which made the Victrix practically a stationary target. He yelled over his shoulder at Karford to cut speed all he could without tearing things apart. When that cripple comes into view, start circling around her. Get into a tight circle above her. He turned back to the man in the screen. If we can get ours. Elves slowed down enough, we'll do all we can to cover you. All you can is all you can, thank you, Prince Trask. Here comes the Enterprise, Karford shouted with obscenely blasphemous embellishments. She hairpinned on us. Well, do something about her. Van Larch was already doing it. The Enterprise had taken damage in the last exchange. Koref's spectroscopes showed her halo-ed with air and water vapor. Her instruments would be getting the same story from the Nemesis. Wedge-shaped segments extending 6 to 8 decks in were sealed off in several places. Then the only thing that could be seen with certainty was the blaze of mutually destroying missiles between. The short-range gun duel began and ended as they passed. In the screen, he had seen a fat, round-nosed thing come up from the Victrix, curving far out ahead of the passing Enterprise. She was almost out of sight. Around the planet when she ran head-on into it and vanished in an awesome blaze. For a moment, he thought she had been destroyed. Then she lurched into sight and went around the curvature of Audhumla. Trask and the Marjukan were shaking hands with themselves at each other in their screens. Everybody in the Nemesis command room was screaming. Well shot, Victrix. Well shot. Then the yo-yo was coming around again, and Van Larch was saying, Gehenna, with this fooling around, I'll fix the expurgated unprintability, he yelled orders, a jumble of code letters and numbers, and things began going out. Most of them blew up in space. Then the yo-yo blew up very quietly, as things do where there is no air to carry shock and sound waves, but very brilliantly. There was brief daylight all over the night side of the planet. That was our planet buster, Larch said. I don't know. What we'll use on Dunnan? I didn't know we had one, Trask admitted. Otto had a couple built on Beowulf. The Beowulfers are good nuclear weaponeers. The Enterprise came back hastily to see what had blown up. Larch put off another entertainment of small stuff with a 50-megaton thermonuclear viewscreen piloted among them. It had its own arsenal of small missiles, and it got through. In the telescopic screen, a jagged hole was visible just below the equator of the Enterprise, the edges curling outward. Something, possibly a heavy missile in an open tube ready for launching, had gone off inside her. What the inside of the ship was like, or how many of her company were still alive, was hard to guess. There were some, and her launchers were still spewing out missiles. They were intercepted and blew up. The hull of the Enterprise bulked huge in the guidance screen. The missile and filled it. The jagged crater that had obliterated the bottom of Dunnan's blue crescent blazon spread to fill the whole screen. The screen went milky white as the pickup went off. All the other screens blazed briefly, until their filters went on. Even afterward, they glared like the cloud-veiled sun of Graham at high noon. Finally, when the light intensity had dropped and the filters went off, there was nothing left of the Enterprise but an orange haze. Somebody, Patrick Baron Moreland, he saw, was pounding him on the back and screaming inarticulately in his ear. A dozen space-armored officers with planet-perched dragons on their breasts were crowding beside Prince Bentrick in the screen from the Victrix, whooping like drunken bisonoid herders on payday night. I wonder, he said, almost inaudibly, if I'll ever know if Andray Dunnan was on that ship. Prince Trask of Nith and Prince Simon Bentrick were dining together on an upper terrace of what had originally been the mansion house of a Federation-period plantation. It had been a number of other things since. Now it was the municipal building of a town that had grown around it, which had somehow escaped undamaged from the Dunnan Blitz. Normally about 5 or 10,000, the place was now jammed with almost 50,000 homeless refugees from half a dozen other towns that had been destroyed, overflowing the buildings and crowding into a sprawling camp of hastily built huts and shelters, and already permanent buildings were going up to accommodate them. Everybody, locals, Marjukans, and Space Vikings, had been busy with the work of relief and reconstruction. This was the first meal the two commanders had been able to share in any leisure at all. Prince Bentrick's enjoyment of it was somewhat impaired by the fact that from where he sat he could see in the distance the sphere of his disabled ship. I doubt we can get her off-planet again, let alone into hyperspace. Well, we'll get you and your crew to Marduk in the Nemesis then. They were both speaking loudly, above the clank and clatter of machinery below. I hope you didn't think I'd leave you stranded here. I don't know how either of us will be received. Space Vikings haven't been exactly popular on Marduk lately. They may thank you for bringing me back to stand trial, Bentrick said bitterly. Why, I'd have anybody shot who let his ship get caught as I did mine. Those two were down in atmosphere before I knew they'd come out of hyperspace. I think they were down on the planet before your ship arrived. Oh, that's ridiculous, Prince Trask, the Marjukan cried. You can't hide a ship on a planet, not from the kind of instruments we have in the Royal Navy. We have pretty fair detection ourselves, Trask reminded him. There's one place where you can do it, at the bottom of an ocean with 1,000 or so feet of water over her. That's where I was going to hide the Nemesis if I got here ahead of Dunnan. Prince Bentrick's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. He lowered it slowly to his plate. That was a theory he'd to accept if he could. But the locals, they didn't know about it. They wouldn't. They have no off-planet detection of their own. Come in directly over the ocean out of the sun and nobody'd see the ship. Is that a regular Space Viking trick? No, I invented it myself on the way from Seshat. But if Dunnan wanted to ambush your ship, he'd have thought of it too. It's the only practical way to do it. Dunnan, or Neville Orme, he wished. He knew and was afraid he would go on wishing all his life. Bentrick started to pick up his fork again, changed his mind, and sipped from his wineglass instead. You may find you're quite welcome on Marduk at that, he said. These raids have only been a serious problem in the last 4 years. I believe, as you do, that this enemy of yours is responsible for all of them. We have half the Royal Navy out now, patrolling our raid planets. Even if he wasn't aboard the Enterprise when you blew her up, you've put a name on him and can tell us a good deal about him. He set down the wineglass. Why, if it weren't so utterly ridiculous, one might even think he was making war on Marduk. From Trask's viewpoint, it wasn't ridiculous at all. He merely mentioned that Andray Dunnan was psychotic and let it go at that. The Victrix was not completely unrepairable, although quite beyond the resources at hand. A fully equipped engineer ship from Marduk could patch her hull and replace her Dillinghams and her Abbott lift-hand drive engines and make her temporarily space-worthy until she could be gotten to a shipyard. They concentrated on repairing the Nemesis, and in another 2 weeks she was ready for the voyage. The 600-hour trip to Marduk passed pleasantly enough. The Marjukan officers were good company, and found their Space Viking opposite numbers equally so. The two crews had become used to working together on Audhumla, and mingled amicably off watch, interesting themselves in each other's hobbies and listening avidly to tales of each other's home planets. The Space Vikings were surprised and disappointed at the somewhat lower intellectual level of the Marjukans. They couldn't understand that. Marduk was supposed to be a civilized planet, wasn't it? The Marjukans were just as surprised and inclined to be resentful that the Space Vikings all acted and talked like officers. Hearing of it, Prince Bentrick was also puzzled. Foxhole hands on a Marjukan ship belonged definitely to the lower orders. There's still too much free land and free opportunity on the Sword Worlds, Trask explained. Nobody does much bowing and scraping to the class above him. He's too busy trying to shove himself up into it. And the men who ship out as Space Vikings are the least class-conscious of the lot. Think my men may have trouble on Marduk about that. They'll all insist on doing their drinking in the swankiest places in town. No, I don't think so. Everybody will be so amazed that Space Vikings aren't 12 feet tall, with 3 horns like a Zarathustra damn-thing and a spiked tail like a Fafnir manticore that they won't even notice anything less. Might do some good in the long run. Crown Prince Edvard will like your Space Vikings. He's much opposed to class distinctions and caste prejudices. Says they have to be eliminated before we can make democracy really work. The Marjukans talked a lot about democracy. They thought well of it. Their government was a representative democracy. It was also a hereditary monarchy, if that made any kind of sense. Trask's efforts to explain the political and social structure of the Sword Worlds met the same incomprehension from Bentrick. Why, it sounds like feudalism to me. That's right, that's what it is. A king owes his position to the support of his great nobles. They owe theirs to their barons and landholding knights. They owe theirs to their people. There are limits beyond which none of them can. Oh, after that, their vassals turn on them. Well, suppose the people of some barony rebel. Won't the king send troops to support the baron? What troops? Outside a personal guard and enough men to police the royal city and hold the crown lands, the king has no troops. If he wants troops, he has to get them from his great nobles. They have to get them from their vassal barons, who raise them by calling out their people. That was enough. A source of dissatisfaction with King Angus of Graham, he had been augmenting his forces by hiring off-planet mercenaries. And the people won't help some other baron oppress his people. It might be their turn next. You mean the people are armed? Prince Bentrick was incredulous. Great Satan, aren't yours? Prince Trask was equally surprised. Then your democracy's a farce, and the people are only free on sufferance. If their ballots aren't secured by arms, they're worthless. Who has the arms on your planet? Why, the government. You mean the king? Prince Bentrick was shocked. Certainly not. Horrid idea. That would be. Why, it would be despotism. Besides, the king wasn't the government at all. The government ruled in the king's name. There was the Assembly, the Chamber of Representatives, and the Chamber of Delegates. The people elected the representatives and the representatives elected the delegates, and the delegates elected the chancellor. Then, there was the prime minister. He was appointed by the king, but the king had to appoint him from the party holding the most seats in the Chamber of Representatives. And he appointed the ministers, who handled the executive work of the government. Only their subordinates in the different ministries were career officials who were selected by competitive examination. And for the bottom jobs and promoted up the bureaucratic ladder from there. This left Trask wondering if the Marjukan Constitution hadn't been devised by Goldberg, the legendary old Terran inventor who always did everything the hard way. It also left him wondering just how in Gehenna the government of Marduk ever got anything done. Maybe it didn't. Maybe that was what saved Marduk from having a real despotism. Well, what prevents the government from enslaving the people? The people can't. You just told me that they aren't armed, and the government is. He continued, pausing now and then for breath, to catalogue every tyranny he had ever heard of, from those practiced by the Terran Federation before the Big War to those practiced at Eglansby on Amaterasu by Pedros and Pedro. A few of the very mildest were pushing the nobles and people of Gra to revolt against Angus I. And in the end, he finished, the government would be the only property owner and the only employer on the planet, and everybody else would be slaves, working at assigned tasks, wearing government-issued clothing and eating government food, their children educated as the government prescribes and trained for jobs selected for them by the government, never reading a book or seeing a play or thinking a thought that the government had not approved. Most of the Marjukans were laughing now. Some of them were accusing him of being just too utterly ridiculous. Why, the people are the government. The people would not legislate themselves into slavery. He wished Otto Harkaman were there. All he knew of history was the little he had gotten from reading some of Harkaman's books, and the long, rambling conversations aboard ship in hyperspace or in the evenings at Rivington. But Harkaman, he was sure, could have furnished hundreds of instances on scores of planets and over 10 centuries of time in which people had done exactly that and hadn't known what they were doing even after it was too late. They have something about like that on Atone, one of the Marjukan officers said. Oh, Atone, that's a dictatorship, pure and simple. That planetary nationalist gang got into control. 50 years ago, during the crisis after the war with Baldur, they were voted into power by the people, weren't they? Yes, they were, Prince Bentrick said gravely. It was an emergency measure, and they were given emergency powers. Once they were in, they made the emergency permanent. That couldn't happen on Marduk, a young nobleman declared. It could if Zaspar Makan's party wins control of the assembly at the next election, Somebody else said. Oh, then Marduk's safe? The sun'll go nova first, one of the junior Royal Navy officers said. After that, they began talking about women, a subject any spaceman will drop any other subject to discuss. Trask made a mental note of the name of Zaspar Makan and took occasion to bring it up in conversation with his shipboard guests. Every time he talked about Makan to 2 or more Marjukans, he heard at least 3 or more opinions about the man. He was a political demagogue, on that everybody agreed. After that, opinions diverged. Macon was a raving lunatic, and all the followers he had were a handful of lunatics like him. He might be a lunatic, but he had a dangerously large following. Well, not so large. Maybe they'd pick up a seat or so in the assembly, but that was doubtful. Not enough of them in any representative district to elect an assemblyman. He was just a smart crook, milking a lot of half-witted plebeians for all he could get out of them. Not just plebes, either. A lot of industrialists were secretly financing him in hope that he would help them break up the labor unions. You're nuts. Everybody knew the labor unions were backing him, hoping he'd scare the employers into granting concessions. You're both nuts, he was back. By the mercantile interests, they were hoping he'd run the Gilgameshires off the planet. Well, that was one thing you had to give him credit for. He wanted to run out the Gilgameshires. Everybody was in favor of that. Now, Trask could remember something he'd gotten from Harkonnen. There had been Hitler, back at the end of the 1st century pre-atomic. Hadn't he gotten into power because everybody was in favor of running out the Christians, or a Moslems, or the Albigensians, or somebody? Marduk had 3 moons, a big one, 1,500 miles in diameter, and 2 insignificant 20-mile chunks of rock. The big one was fortified, and a couple of ships were in orbit around it. The Nemesis was challenged as she emerged from her last hyperjump. Both ships broke orbit and came out to meet her, and several more were detected lifting away from the planet. Inspector took the communication screen and immediately encountered difficulties. The Commandant, even after the situation had been explained twice to him, couldn't understand. A Royal Navy fleet unit knocked out in a battle with Space Vikings was bad enough, but being rescued and brought to Marduk by another Space Viking simply didn't make sense. He then screened the royal palace at Malverton, on the planet. First he was icily polite to somebody several echelons below him in the peerage, and then respectfully polite to somebody he addressed as Prince Vandervent. Finally, after some minutes' wait, a frail, white-haired man in a little black cap of maintenance appeared in the screen. Prince Bentrick instantly sprang to his feet. So did all the other Marjukans in the command room. Your Majesty, I am most deeply honored. Are you all right, Simon? The old gentleman asked solicitously. They haven't done anything to you, have they? Saved my life and my men's and treated me like a friend and a comrade, Your Majesty. Have I your permission to present, informally, their commander, Prince Trask of Tanith? Indeed you may, Simon. I owe the gentleman my deepest thanks. His Majesty Mikhail the 8th, Planetary King of Marduk, Prince Bentrick said. His Highness Lucas, Prince Trask, Planetary Viceroy of Tanith for His Majesty Angus the 1st of Graham. The elderly monarch bowed his head slightly. Trask bowed a little more deeply, from the waist. I am very happy, Prince Trask, first I confess, at the safe return of my kinsman Prince Bentrick, and then at the honor of meeting one in the confidence of my fellow sovereign King Angus of Graham. I will never be ungrateful for what you did for my cousin and for his office. And men, you must stay at the palace while you are on this planet. I am giving orders for your reception, and I wish you to be formally presented to me this evening. He hesitated briefly. Graham, that is one of the sword worlds, is it not? Another brief hesitation. Are you really a Space Viking, Prince Trask? Maybe he'd expected Space Vikings to have 3 horns and a spiked tail and stand 12 feet tall himself. Took several hours for the Nemesis to get into orbit. Bentrick spent most of them in a screen booth and emerged visibly relieved. Nobody's going to be sticky about what happened on Audhumla, he told Trask. There will be a board of inquiry. I'm afraid I had to mix you up in that. It's not only about the action on Audhumla. Everybody from the Space Minister down wants to hear what you know about this fellow Dunnan. Like yourself. We all hope he went to MC Square along with his flagship, but we can't take it for granted. We have over a dozen trade planets to protect, and he's hit more than half of them already. The process of getting into orbit took them around the planet several times, and it was a more impressive spectacle at each circuit. Of course, Marduk had a population of almost 2 billion and had been civilized, with no hiatus of neo-barbarism since it had first been colonized in the 4th century. Even so, the Space Vikings were amazed and stubbornly refusing to show it at what they saw in the telescopic screens. Look at that city, Patrick Morland whispered. We talk about the civilized planets, but I never realized they were anything like this. Why, this makes Excalibur look like Tanith. The city was Malverton, the capital, like any city of a contragravity-using people. It lay in a rough circle of buildings towering out of green interspaces, surrounded by the smaller circles of spaceports and industrial suburbs. The difference was that any of these were as large as Camelot on Excalibur or 4 Wardshavens on Graham, and Malverton itself was almost half the size of the whole barony of Traskin. They aren't any more civilized than we are, Patrick. There are just more of them. If there were 2 billion people on Graham, which I hope there never will be, Graham would have cities like this too. One thing, the government of a planet like Marduk would have to be something more elaborate than the loose feudalism of the Sword Worlds. Maybe this Goldbergocracy of theirs had been forced upon them by the sheer complexity of the population and its problems. Alvin Carford took a quick look around him to make sure none of the Marjukans were in earshot. I don't care how many people they have, he said. Marduk can be had. A wolf never cares how many sheep there are in a flock. With 20 ships, we could take this planet like we took Eglansby. There'd be losses coming in, sure, but after we were in and down, we'd have it. Where would we get 20 ships? Tanith, at a pinch, could muster 5 or 6, counting the free Space Vikings who used them. Ace facilities, they would have to leave a couple to hold the planet. Beowulf had one and another almost completed, and now there was an Amaterasu ship. But to assemble a Space Viking armada of 20? He shook his head. The real reason why Space Vikings had never raided a civilized planet successfully had always been their inability to combine under one command in sufficient strength. Besides, he didn't want to raid Marda. A raid, if successful, would yield immense treasures but cause 100, even 1,000, times as much destruction, and he didn't want to destroy anything civilized. The landing stages of the palace were crowded when he and Prince Bentrick landed, and at a discreet distance, swarms of air vehicles circled, creating a control problem for the police. Parting from Bentrick, he was escorted to the suite prepared for him. It was luxurious in the extreme, but scarcely above Sword World standards. There were a surprising number of human servants, groveling and fawning and getting underfoot, and doing work robots could have been doing better. What robots there were inefficient, and much work and ingenuity had been lavished on efforts to copy human form to the detriment of function. After getting rid of most of the superfluous servants, he put on a screen and began sampling the newscasts. There were telescopic views of the Nemesis from some craft on orbit nearby, and he watched the officers and men of the Victrix being disembarked. There were other views of their landing at some naval installation on the ground, and he could see reporters being chevied away by Navy ground police. And there was a wide range of commentary opinion. The government had already denied that. 1. Prince Bentrick had captured the Nemesis and brought her in as a prize, and 2. The Space Vikings had captured Prince Bentrick and were holding him for ransom. Beyond that, the government was trying to sit on the whole story, and the opposition was hinting darkly at corrupt deals and sinister plots. Prince Bentrick arrived in the midst of an impassioned tirade against pusillanimous traitors surrounding His Majesty who were betraying Marduk to the Space Vi. Kings, why doesn't your government publish the facts and put a stop to that nonsense? Trask asked. Oh, let them rave, Bentrick replied. The longer the government waits, the more they'll be ridiculed when the facts are published, or the more people will be convinced that the government had something to hush up and had to take time to construct a plausible story. He kept the thought to himself. It was their government, how they mismanaged it was their own business. He found that there was no bartending robot. He had to have a human servant bring drinks. He made up his mind to have a few of the Nemesis robots sent down to him. The formal presentation would be in the evening. There would be a dinner first, and because Trask had not yet been formally presented, he couldn't dine with the king, but because he was, or claimed to be, Viceroy of Tanith, he ranked as a chief of stay. Iden would dine with the Crown Prince, to whom there would be an informal introduction first. This took place in a small antechamber off the banquet hall. The Crown Prince and Crown Princess and Princess Bentrick were there when they arrived. The Crown Prince was a man of middle age, graying at the temples, with the glassy stare that betrayed contact lenses. The resemblance between him and his father was apparent. Both had the same studious and actical expression, and might have been professors on the same university faculty. He shook hands with Trask, assuring him of the gratitude of the court and royal family. "You know, Simon is next in succession after myself and my little daughter," he said. "That's too close to take chances with him." He turned to Bentrick. "I'm afraid this is your last space adventure, Simon. You'll have to be a spaceport spaceman from now on." "I shan't be." "Sorry," Princess Bentrick said. "And if anybody owes Prince Trask gratitude, I do." She pressed his hands warmly. "Prince Trask, my son wants to meet you very badly. He's 10 years old and he thinks Space Vikings are romantic heroes. He should be one for a while. He should just see a planet Space Vikings had raided. Most of the people at the upper end of the table were diplomats, ambassadors from Odin and Baldu, and Isis and Ishtar and Atone and the other civilized worlds. No doubt they hadn't actually expected horns and a spiked tail, or even tattooing and a nose ring, but after all, Space Vikings were just some sort of neo-barbarians, weren't they? On the other hand, they had all seen views and gotten descriptions of the Nemesis, and had heard about the ship action on Audhumla, and this Prince Trask, a Space Viking prince, that's Sao. Did civilized enough, had saved a life with only 3 other lives, one almost at an end between it and the throne, and they had heard about the screen conversation with King Mikhill. So they were courteous through the meal, and tried to get as close as possible to him in the procession to the throne room. King Mikhill wore a golden crown topped by the planetary emblem, which must have weighed twice as much as a combat helmet, and fur-edged. Robes that would weigh more than a suit of space armor. They weren't nearly as ornate, though, as the regalia of King Angus I of Graham. He rose to clasp Prince Bentrick's hand, calling him dear cousin, and congratulating him on his gallant fight and fortunate escape. That knocks any court-martial talk on the head, Trask thought. He remained standing to shake hands with Trask, calling him valued friend to me in my house. First purr. Since singular, that must be causing some lifted eyebrows. Then the king sat down, and the rest of the roomful filed up onto the dais to be received. And finally it was over, and the king rose and proceeded, followed by his immediate suite between the bowing and curtsying court and out the wide doors. After a decent interval, Crown Prince Edvard escorted him and Prince Bentrick down the same route, the others falling in behind and across the hall to the ballroom, where there was soft music and refreshments. It wasn't too unlike a court reception on Excalibur, except that the drinks and canapes were being dispensed by human servants. He was wondering what sort of court functions Angus the First of Graham was holding by now. After half an hour, a posse of court functionaries approached and informed him that it had pleased His Majesty to command Prince Trask to attend him in his private chambers. There was an audible gasp at this. Both Prince Bentrick and the Crown Prince were trying not to grin too broadly. Evidently this didn't happen too often. He followed the functionaries from the ballroom, and the eyes of everybody else followed him. Old King Mikhill received him alone, in a small, comfortably shabby room behind vast ones of incredible splendor. He wore fur-lined slippers and a loose robe with a fur collar and his little black cap of maintenance. He was standing when Trask entered. When the guards closed the door and left them alone, he beckoned Trask to a couple of chairs, with a low table, on which were decanters and glasses and cigars between. "It's a presumption on royal authority to summon you from the ballroom," he began, after they had seated themselves and filled glasses. "You are quite the cynosure, you know. I'm Grey. Itful to your Majesty. It's both comfortable and quiet here, and I can sit down. Your Majesty was the center of attention in the throne room, yet I seemed to detect a look of relief as you left it. I try to hide it as much as possible." The old king took off the little gold-circled cap and hung it on the back of his chair. "Majesty can be rather wearying, you know, so he could come here and put it off." Trask felt that some gesture should be made on his own part. He unfastened the dress dagger from his belt and laid it on the table. The king nodded. "Now we can be a couple of honest tradesmen, our shops closed for the evening, relaxing over our wine and tobacco," he said. Goodman Lucas?" It seemed like an initiation into a secret society whose ritual he must guess at step by step. "Right, Goodman Mikhill." They lifted their glasses to each other and drank. Goodman Mikhill offered cigars, and Goodman Lucas held a light for him. "I hear a few hard things about your trade, Goodman Lucas. All true and mostly understated, We're professional murderers and robbers, as one of my fellow tradesmen says. The worst of it is that robbery and murder become just that, a trade like servicing robots or selling groceries. Yet you fought 2 other Space Vikings to cover my cousin's crippled. Ictrix, why? So he must tell his tale so worn and smooth again. King Mikhil's cigar went out while he listened, and you have been hunting him ever since, and now you can't be sure whether you killed him or not. I'm afraid I didn't. The man in the screen is the only man Dunnan can really trust. One or the other would stay wherever he has his base all the time. And when you do kill him, what then? I'll go on trying to make civilized planet of Tanith. Sooner or later I'll have one quarrel too many with King Angus, and then we will be Our Majesty Lucas the First of Tanith, and we will sit on a throne and receive our subjects. And I'll be glad when I can get my crown off and talk to a few men who call me shipmate, instead of Your Majesty. Well, it would violate professional ethics for me to advise a subject to renounce his sovereign, of course. But that might be an excellent thing. You met the ambassador from Ithaval at dinner, did you not? 3 centuries ago, Ithaval was a colony of Marduk. It seems we can't afford colonies anymore, and it seceded from us. Ithaval was then a planet like your Tanith seems to be. Today, it is a civilized world and one of Marduk's best friends. You know, sometimes I think a few lights are coming on again, here and there in the old Federation. If so, you Space Vikings are helping to light them. You mean the planets we use as bases and the things we teach the locals. That too, of course. Civilization needs civilized technologies, but they have to be used for civilized ends. You know anything about a Space Viking raid on a Tone over a century ago? 6 ships from Haltekler, 4 destroyed, the other 2 returned damaged and without booty. The king of Marduk nodded. That raid saved civilization on a Tone. There were 4 great nations. The 2 greatest were at the brink of war, and the others were waiting to pounce on the exhausted victor and then fight each other for the spoils. The Space Vikings forced them to unite. Out of that temporary alliance came the League for Common Defense, and from that the Planetary Republic. The Republic's a dictatorship now, and just be. Between Goodman Mikhil and Goodman Lucas, it's a nasty one, and Our Majesty's government doesn't like it at all. It will be smashed sooner or later, but they'll never go back to divided sovereignty and nationalism again. The Space Vikings frightened them out of that when the dangers inherent in it couldn't. Maybe this man Dunnan will do the same for us on Marduk. You have troubles? You've seen decivilized planets. How does it happen? I know how it's happened on a good many. War, destruction of cities and industries, survivors among ruins, too busy keeping their own bodies alive to try to keep civilization alive. Then they lose all knowledge of how to be civilized. That's catastrophic decivilization. There is also decivilization by erosion, and while it's going on, nobody notices it. Everybody is proud of their civilization, their wealth and culture. Trade is falling off, fewer ships come in each year. So there is boastful talk about planetary self-sufficiency. Who needs off-planet trade anyhow? Everybody seems to have money, but the government is always broke. Deficit spending, and always the vital social services for which the government has to spend money. The most vital one, of course, is buying votes to keep the government in power. And it gets harder for the government to get anything done. The soldiers are sloppier at drill, and their uniforms and weapons aren't taken care of. The non-coms are insolent, and more parts of the city are dangerous at night, and then even in the daytime. And it's been years since a new building went up, and the old ones aren't being repaired anymore. Trask closed his eyes. Again, he could feel the mellow sun of Graham on his back, and hear the laughing voices on the lower terrace, and he was talking to Lothar F. Fail and Rovard Groffies and Alex Gorham and cousin Nicolay and Otto Harkaman. He said, and finally, nobody bothers fixing anything up, and the power reactors stop, and nobody seems to be able to get them started again. It hasn't quite gotten that far on the Sword Worlds yet. It hasn't here either. Yet. Goodman Mikhil slipped away. King Mikhil Roman VIII looked across the low table at his guest. Prince Trask, have you heard of a man named Zaspar Makan? Occasionally. Nothing good about him. He is the most dangerous man on this planet, the king said, and I can make nobody believe it, not even my son. Prince Bentrick's 10-year-old son, Count Stephen of Ravery, wore the uniform of an ensign of the Royal Navy. He was accompanied by his tutor, an elderly Navy captain. They both opt in the doorway of Trask's suite, and the boy saluted smartly. "Permission to come aboard, sir?" he asked. "Welcome aboard, Count Captain. Belay the ceremony and find seats. You're just in time for second breakfast." As they sat down, he aimed his ultraviolet light pencil at a serving robot. Unlike Margican robots, which looked like surrealist conceptions of pre-atomic armored knights, it was a smooth ovoid floating a few inches from the floor on its own contragravity. As it approached, its top opened like a bursting beetle shell and hinged trays of food swung out. The boy looked at it in fascination. "Is that a Sword World robot, sir, or did you capture it somewhere?" "It's one of our own." He was pardonably proud. It had been built on Tanith a year before. "Has an ultrasonic dishwasher underneath, and it does some cooking on top at the back." The elderly captain was, if anything, even more impressed than his young charge. He knew what went into it, and he had some conception of the society that would develop things like that. "I take it you don't use many human servants with robots like that," he said. "Not many. We're all low-population planets, and nobody wants to be a servant. We have too many people on Marduk, and all of them want soft jobs as nobles." "Servants," the captain said. "Those that want any kind of jobs. You need all your people for fighting men, don't you?" the boy count asked. "Well, we need a good many. The smallest of our ships will carry 500 men, most of them around 800. The captain lifted an eyebrow. The complement of the Victrix had been 300, and she'd been a big ship. Then he nodded. "Of course, most of them are ground fighters." Started Count Stephen off. Questions about battles and raids and booty and the planets Trask had seen. "I wish I were a Space Viking." "Well, you can't be, Count Ravery. You're an officer of the Royal Navy. You're supposed to fight Space Vikings. I won't fight you." "You'd have to if the king commanded," the old captain told him. "No, Prince Trask is my friend. He saved my father's life. And I won't fight you either, Count. We'll make a lot of fireworks, and then we'll each go home and claim victory. How would that be?" "I've heard of things like that," the captain said. "We had a war with Odin 70 years ago. That was mostly that sort of battles." "Besides, the king is Prince Trask's friend too," the boy insisted. "Father and Mummy heard him say so right on the throne. Kings don't lie when they're on the throne, do they?" "Good kings don't," Trask told him. "Ours is a good king," the young Count of Ravery declared proudly. "I would do anything my king commanded, except fight Prince Trask. My house owes Prince Trask a debt." Trask nodded approvingly. "That's the way a Sword World noble would talk, Count Stephen," he said. The Board of Inquiry that afternoon was more like a small and very sedate cocktail party. An Admiral Schefter, who seemed to be very high brass, presided while airfully avoiding the appearance of doing so. Alvin Carford and Van Larch and Patrick Morland were there from the Nemesis, and Bentrick and several of the officers from the Victrix, and there were a couple of naval intelligence officers, and somebody from operational planning, and from ship construction and research and development. They chatted pleasantly and in a deceptively random manner for a while. Then Schefter said, "Well, there's no blame or censure or of any sort for the way Commodore Prince Bentrick was surprised. That couldn't have been avoided at the time." He looked at the research and development officer. "It shouldn't be allowed to happen many more times, though." "Not many more, sir. I'd say it'll take my people a month, and then the time it'll take to get all the ships equipped as they come in. Ship construction didn't think that would take too long. We'll see to it that you get full in. Formation on the new submarine detection system, Prince Trask," the Admiral said. "You gentlemen understand you'll have to keep it under your helmets, though," one of the intelligence men added. "If it got out that we were informing Space Vikings about our technical secrets." He felt the back of his neck in a way that made Trask suspect that beheadment was the customary form of execution on Marduk. "We'll have to find out where the fellow has his base," operational planning said. "I take it, Prince Trask, that you're not going to assume that he was on his flagship when you blew it and just put paid to him and forget him?" "Oh, no, I'm assuming that he wasn't. I don't believe he and Orm went anywhere on the same ship after he came out here and established a base. I think one of them would stay home all the time." "Well, we'll give you everything we have on that," Schefter promised. "Most of that is classified, and you'll have to keep quiet about it, too. I just skimmed over the summary of what you gave us. I dare say we'll both get a lot of new information." Have you any idea at all where he might be based, Prince Trask? Only that we think it's a non-Terra-type planet. He told them about Dunnan's heavy purchases of air and water recycling equipment and carniculture and hydroponic material. That, of course, helps a great deal. Yes, there are only about 5 million planets in the former Federation space volume that are inhabitable in artificial environment, including a few completely covered by seas where you could put in underwater dome cities if you had the time and material. One of the intelligence officers had been nursing a glass with a tiny remnant of cocktail in it. He downed it suddenly, filled the glass again, and glowered at it in silence for a while. Then he drank it briskly and refilled it. "What I should like to know," he said, "is how this double obscenity of a Dunnan knew we'd have a ship on Audhumla just when we did," he said. "Your talking about underwater dome cities reminded me of it. I don't think he just pulled that planet out of a hat and then went there prepared to sit on the bottom of the ocean for a year and a half waiting. Or something to turn up. I think he knew the Victrix was coming to Audhumla and just about when." "I don't like that, Commodore," Schefter said. "You think I do, sir," the intelligence officer countered. "There it is, though. We all have to face it." "We do," Schefter agreed. "Get on it, Commodore, and I don't need to caution you to screen everybody you put onto it very carefully." He looked at his own glass. It had a bare thimble. Full in the bottom, he replenished it slowly and carefully. It's been a long time since the navies had anything like this to worry about. He turned to Trask. "I suppose I can get in touch with you at the palace whenever I must." "Well, Prince Trask and I have been invited as house guests at Prince Edvard's, Baron Cragdale's, hunting lodge," Bentrick said. "We'll be going there directly from here." "Ah," Admiral Schefter smiled slightly. Beside not having 3 horns and a spiked tail, this Space Viking was definitely persona grata with the royal family. "Well, we'll keep in contact, Prince Trask." Cragdale Hunting Lodge. The hunting lodge where Crown Prince Edvard was simple Baron Cragdale lay at the head of a sharply sloping mountain valley down which a river tumbled. Mountains rose on either side in high scarps, some topped with perpetual snow, glaciers curling down from them. The lower ranges were forested, as was the valley between, and there was a red-mauve alpenglow on the great peak that rose from the head of the valley. For the first time in over a year, Elaine was with him, silently clinging to him to see the beauty of it through his eyes. He had thought that she had gone from him forever. The hunting lodge itself was not quite what a sword-worlder would expect a hunting lodge to be. At first sight from the air, it looked like a sundial, a slender tower rising like a gnomon above a circle of low buildings and formal gardens. The boat landed at the foot of it, and he and Prince and Princess Bentrick and the young Count of Ravery and his tutor descended. Immediately they were beset by a flurry of servants. The second boat with the Bentrick servants and their luggage was circling into land. Elaine, he discovered, wasn't with him anymore, and then he was separated from the Bentricks and was being floated up an inside shaft in a lifter car. More servants installed him in his rooms, unpacked his cases, drew his bath and even tried to help him take it and fussed over him while he dressed. There were over a score for dinner. Bentrick had warned him that he'd find some odd types. Maybe he meant that they wouldn't all be nobles. Among the commoners there were some professor. Mostly social sciences, a labor leader, a couple of representatives and a member of the Chamber of Delegates, and a couple of social workers, whatever that meant. His own table companion was a Lady Valerie Alvarath. She was beautiful, black hair and almost startlingly blue eyes, a combination unusual in the sword worlds, and she was intelligent, or at least cleverly articulate. She was introduced as the lady companion of the Crown Prince's daughter. When he asked where the daughter was, she laughed. "She won't be helping entertain visiting Space Vikings for a long time, Prince Trask. She is precisely 8 years old. I saw her getting ready for bed before I came down here. I'll look in on her after dinner." Then the Crown Princess Melanie, on his other hand, asked him some question about Sword World court etiquette. He stuck to generalities and what he could remember from a presentation at the Court of Excalibur during his student days. These people had a monarchy since before Graham had been colonized. He wasn't going to admit that Graham's had been established since he went off-planet. The table was small enough for everybody to hear what he was saying and to feed questions to him. It lasted all through the meal and continued when they adjourned for coffee in the library. "But what about your form of government, your social structure, that sort of thing?" Somebody, impatient with the artificialities of the court, wanted to know. "Well, we don't use the word government very much," he replied. "We talk a lot about authority and sovereignty, and I'm afraid we burn entirely too much powder over it, but government always seems to us like sovereignty interfering in matters that don't concern it. As long as sovereignty maintains a reasonable semblance of good public order and makes the more serious forms of crime fairly hazardous for the criminals, we're satisfied. But that's just negative. Doesn't the government do anything positive for the people?" He tried to explain the Sword World feudal system to them. It was hard, he found, to explain something you have taken for granted all your life to somebody who is quite unfamiliar with it. "But the government, the sovereignty, since you don't like the other word, doesn't do anything for the people," one of the professors objected. "It leaves all the social services to the whim of the individual lord or baron. And the people have no voice at all. Why, that's tyranny," a professor assemblyman added. He tried to explain that the people had a very distinct and commanding voice, and that barons and lords who wanted to stay alive listened attentively to it. The assemblyman changed his mind. That wasn't tyranny, it was anarchy, and the professor was still insistent about who performed the social services. "If you mean schools and hospitals and keeping the city clean, the people do that for themselves. The government, if you want to think of it as that, just sees to it that nobody's shooting at them while they're doing it." "That isn't what Professor Pulwell means, Lucas. He means old age pensions," Prince Bentrick said. "Like this thing Zaspar Macken's whooping for." He'd heard about that, on the voyage from Audhumla. Every person on Marduk would be retired on an adequate pension after 30 years regular employment, or at the age of 60. When he had wanted to know where the money would come from, he had been told that there would be a sales tax, and that the pensions must all be spent within 30 days, which would stimulate business, and the increased business would provide tax money to pay the pensions. "We have a joke about 3 Gilgameshers space-wrecked on an uninhabited planet," he said. 10 years later, when they were rescued, all 3 were immensely wealthy, from trading hats with each other. That's about the way this thing will work. One of the lady social workers bristled. It wasn't right to make derogatory jokes about racial groups. One of the professors harumphed. Wasn't a parallel at all. The self-sustaining rotary pension plan was perfectly feasible. With a shock, Trask recalled that he was a professor of economics. Alvin Carford wouldn't need any 20 ships to loot Marduk. Just infiltrate it with about 100 smart confidence men, and inside a year they'd own everything on it. That started them all off on Zaspar Macken, though. Some of them thought he had a few good ideas, but was damaging his own case by extremism. One of the wealthier nobles said that he was a reproach to the ruling class. It was their fault that people like Macken could gain a following. One old gentleman said that maybe the Gilgameshers were to blame themselves for some of the animosity toward them. He was immediately set upon by all the others and verbally torn to pieces on the spot. Trask didn't feel it proper. To quote Goodman Mickhill to this crowd, he took the responsibility upon himself for saying, "From what I've heard of him, I think he's the most serious threat to civilized society on Marduk." They didn't call him crazy, after all he was a guest, but they didn't ask him what he meant, either. They merely told him that Macken was a crackpot with a contemptible following of half-wits, and just wait till the election and see what happened. "I'm inclined to agree with Prince Trask," Bentrick said soberly. "And I'm afraid the election results will be a shock to us, not to Macken." He hadn't talked that way on the ship. Maybe he'd been looking around and doing some thinking since he got back. He might have been talking to Goodman Mickhill, too. There was a screen in the room. He nodded toward it. "He's speaking at a rally of the People's Welfare Party at Dreplin now," he said. "I put it on to show you what I mean." When the Crown Prince assented, he snapped on the screen and twiddled at the selector. A face looked out of it. The features weren't Andray Dunnan's. The mouth was wider, the cheekbones broader, the chin more rounded, but his eyes were Dunnan's, as Trask had seen them on the terrace of Karvall House. Mad eyes. His high-pitched voice screamed, "Our beloved sovereign is a prisoner? He is surrounded by traitors? The ministries are full of them. They are all traitors. The bloodthirsty reactionaries of the falsely so-called Crown Loyalist Party, the grasping conspiracy of the interstellar bankers, The dirty Gilgameshers. They are all leagued together in an unholy conspiracy. And now this Space Viking, this bloody-handed monster from the Sword Worlds. Shut the horrible man off, somebody was yelling, in competition with the hypnotic scream of the speaker. The trouble was they couldn't. They could turn off the screen, but Zaspar Makan would go on screaming, and millions all over the planet would still hear him. Bentrick twiddled the selector. The voice stuttered briefly, and then came echoing out of the speaker, but this time the pickup was somewhere several hundred feet above a great open park. It was densely packed with people, most of them wearing clothes a farm tramp on Graham wouldn't be found dead in. But here and there among them were blocks of men in what was almost but not quite military uniform, each with a short and thick swagger stick with a knobbed head. Across the park in the distance, the head and shoulders of Zaspar Makan loomed 100 feet high in a huge screen. Whenever he stopped for breath, a shout would go up, beginning with the blocks of uniformed men. Makan, Makan, Makan the leader, Makan to power. You even. Let him have a private army, he asked the Crown Prince. Oh, those silly buffoons in their musical comedy uniforms, the Crown Prince shrugged. They aren't armed, not visibly, he granted. Not yet. I don't know where they'd get arms. No, Your Highness, Prince Bentrick said. Neither do I. That's what I'm worried about. He succeeded the next morning in convincing everybody that he wanted to be alone for a while and was sitting in a garden, watching the rainbows in the midst of a big waterfall across the valley. Elaine would have liked that, but she wasn't with him now. Then he realized that somebody was speaking to him in a small, bashful voice. He turned and saw a little girl in shorts and a sleeveless jacket, holding in her arms a long-haired blonde puppy with big ears and appealing eyes. Hello, both of you, he said. The puppy wriggled and tried to lick the girl's face. Don't, Mopsy, we want to talk to this gentleman, she said. Are you really and truly the Space Viking? Really and truly. And who are you two? I'm Mina, and this is Mopsy. Hello, Mina. Hello, Mopsy. Hearing his name, the puppy wriggled again and dropped from the child's arms. After a brief hesitation, he came over and jumped onto Trask's lap, licking his face. While he petted the dog, the girl came over and sat on the bench beside him. Mopsy likes you, she said. After a moment, she added, I like you too, and I like you, he said. Would you want to be my girl? You know, a Space Viking has to have a girl on every planet. How would you like to be my girl on Marduk? Mina thought that over carefully. I'd like to, but I couldn't. You see, I'm going to have to be queen someday. Oh, yes, Grandpa is king now, and when he's through being king, Papa will have to be king, and then when he's through being king, I can't be king because I'm a girl, so I'll have to be queen. And I can't be anybody's girl, because I'm going to have to marry somebody I don't know for reasons of state. She thought some more and lowered her voice. I'll tell you a secret. I am a queen now. Oh, you are, she nodded. We are queen in our own right of our royal bedroom, our royal layroom, and our royal bathroom, and Mopsy is our faithful subject. Is your majesty absolute ruler of these domains? No, she said disgustedly. We must at all times defer to our royal ministers, just like Grandpa has to. That means I have to do just what they tell me to. That's Lady Valerie and Margaret and Dame Eunice and Sir Thomas. But Grandpa says they are good and wise ministers. Are you really a prince? I didn't know Space Vikings were princes. Well, my king says I am, and I am ruler of my planet, and I'll tell you a secret. I don't have to do what anybody tells me. Gee, are you a tyrant? You're awfully big and strong. I'll bet you've slain just hundreds of cruel and wicked enemies. Thousands, your majesty. He wished that weren't literally true. He didn't know how many of them had been little girls like Mina and Little Dog. It's like Mopsy. He found that he was holding both of them tightly. The girl was saying, but you feel bad about it. These children must be telepaths. A Space Viking who is also a prince must do many things he doesn't want to do. I know. So does a queen. I hope Grandpa and Papa don't get through being king for just years and years. She looked over his shoulder. Oh, and now I suppose I've got to do something else, don't want to. Lessons, I bet. He followed her eyes. The girl who had been his dinner companion was approaching. She wore a wide sunshade hat and a gown that trailed filmy gauze like sunset-colored mist. There was another woman in the garb of an upper servant with her. Lady Valerie, and who else? He whispered. Margaret, she's my nurse. She's awful strict, but she's nice. Prince Trask, has Her Highness been bothering you? Lady Valerie asked. Oh, far from it. He rose, still holding the funny little dog. But you should say, Her Majesty. She has informed me that she is sovereign of 3 princely domains and of 1 dear loving subject. He gave the subject back to the sovereign. You should not have told Prince Trask that, Lady Valerie chided. When your Majesty is outside her domains, your Majesty must remain incognito. Now your Majesty must go with the Minister of the Bedchamber. The Minister of Education awaits an audience. Arithmetic, I bet. Well, goodbye, Prince Trask. I hope I can see you again. Say goodbye, Mopsy. She went away with her nurse, the little dog looking back over her shoulder. I came out to enjoy the gardens alone, he said, and now I find I'd rather enjoy them in company. If your ministerial duties do not forbid, could you be the company? But glad. Prince Trask, Her Majesty will be occupied with serious affairs of state. Square route. Have you seen the grottos? They're down this way. That afternoon, one of the gentlemen attendants caught up with him. Baron Cragdale would be gratified if Prince Trask could find time to talk with him privately. Before they had talked more than a few minutes, however, Baron Cragdale abruptly became Crown Prince Edvard. Prince Trask, Admiral. Efter tells me that you and he are having informal discussions about cooperation against this mutual enemy of ours, Dunnan. This is fine. It has my approval, and the approval of Prince Vandervent, the Prime Minister, and, I might add, that of Goodman Mickhill. I think it ought to go further, though. A formal treaty between Tanith and Marduk would be greatly to the advantage of both. I'd be inclined to think so, Prince Edvard. But aren't you proposing marriage on rather short acquaintance? It's only been 50 hours since the Nemesis orbited in here. Well, we know a bit about you and your planet beforehand. There's a large Gilgameshire colony here. You have a few on Tanith, haven't you? Well, anything one Gilgameshire knows, they all find out, and ours are cooperative with naval intelligence. That would be why Andray Dunnan was having no dealings with Gilgame. Sures, it would also be what Zaspar Macken meant when he ranted about the Gilgamish interstellar conspiracy. I can see where an arrangement like that would be mutually advantageous. I'd be quite in favor of it. Cooperation against Dunnan, of course, and reciprocal trade rights on each other's trade planets, and direct trade between Marduk and Tanith. And Beowulf and Amaterasu would come into it, too. Does this also have the approval of the Prime Minister and the King? Goodman Mickhill's in favor of it. There's a distinction between him and the King, as you'll have noticed. The King can't be in favor of anything till the Assembly or the Chancellor express an opinion. Prince Vandervent favors it personally. As Prime Minister, he is reserving his opinion. We'll have to get the support of the Crown Loyalist Party before he can take an unequivocal position. Well, Baron. Cragdale, speaking as Baron Trask of Traskin, suppose we just work out a rough outline of what this treaty ought to be, and then consult, unofficially, with a few people whom you can trust, and see what can be done about presenting it to the proper government officials. The Prime Minister came to Cragdale that evening, heavily incognito and accompanied by several leaders of the Crown Loyalist Party. In principle, they all favored a treaty with Tanith. Politically, they had doubts. Not before the election, too controversial a subject. Controversial, it appeared, was the dirtiest dirty name anything could be called on Marduk. It would alienate the labor vote. They'd think increased imports would threaten employment in Marjukan industries. Some of the interstellar trading companies would like a chance at the Tanith planets. Others would resent Tanith ships being given access to theirs. And Zaspar Macken's party were already shrieking protests about the Nemesis being repaired by the Royal Navy. And a couple of professors who inclined toward Macken had introduced a resolution calling for the court-martial of Prince Bentrick and an investigation of the loyalty of Admiral Schefter. And somebody else, probably a stooge of Macken's, was claiming that Bentrick had sold the Victrix to the Space Vikings, and that the films of the Battle of Audhumla were fakes, photographed in miniature at the Navy moon base. Admiral Schefter, when Trask flew in to see him the next day, was contemptuous about this last. Ignore the whole bloody thing. We get something like that before every general election. On this planet, you can always kick the Gilgameshires and the armed forces with impunity. Neither have votes and neither can kick back. The whole thing'll be forgotten the day after the election. It always is. That's if Macken doesn't win the election, Trask qualified. That's no matter who wins the election. They can't any of them get along without the Navy, and they bloody well know it. Trask wanted to know if intelligence had been getting anything. Not on how Dunnan found out the Victrix had been ordered to Audhumla, no, Schefter said. There wasn't any secrecy about it, at least 1,000 people from Mice. Elf down to the shoeshine boys could have known about it as soon as the order was taped. As for the list of ships you gave me, yes. One of them puts into this planet regularly. She spaced out from here only yesterday morning. The honest Horrors. Well, great Satan, haven't you done anything? I don't know if there's anything we can do. Oh, we're investigating, but... You see, this ship first showed up here 4 years ago, commanded by some kind of a neobarb, not a Gilgameshire, named Horus Sastroff. He claimed to be from Skathi. The locals there have a few ships. The Space Vikings had a base on Skathi about 100 or so years ago. Naturally, the ship had no papers. Tramp trading among the neobarbs, it might be years before you'd put in on a planet where they'd ever heard of ship's papers. The ship seems to have been in bad shape, probably abandoned on Skathi as junk a century ago and tinkered up by the locals. She was in here twice, according to the commercial shipping records, and the second time she was in too bad shape to be moved out, and Sastroff couldn't pay to have her rebuilt, so she was libeled for spaceport charges and sold. Someone Lung Trading Company bought her and fixed her up a little. They went bankrupt in a year or so, and she was bought by another small Umpany Star Traders Limited, and they've been using her on a milk run to and from Gimli. They seem to be a legitimate outfit, but we're looking into them. We're looking for Sastroff, too, but we haven't been able to find him. If you have a ship out Gimli way, you might find out if anybody there knows anything about her. You may discover that she hasn't been going there at all. We might, at that, Schefter agreed. We'll just fine. Doubt. Everybody at Cragdale knew about the projected treaty with Tanith by the morning after Trask's first conversation with Prince Edvard on the subject. The queen of the royal bedroom, the royal playroom, and the royal bathroom was insisting that her domains should have a treaty with Tanith, too. It was beginning to look to Trask, as though that would be the only treaty he'd sign on Marduk, and he was having his doubts about that. You think it would be wise? He asked Lady Valerie Alvarath. The queen of 3 rooms and 1 4-footed subject had already decreed that Lady Valerie should be the Space Viking prince's girl on the planet of Marduk. If it got out, these people's welfare lunatics would pick it up and twist it into evidence of some kind of a sinister plot. Oh, I believe Her Majesty could sign a treaty with Prince Trask, Her Majesty's Prime Minister Dis. I did, but it would have to be kept very secret. Gee, Minna's eyes widened. A real secret treaty, just like the wicked rulers of the old dictatorship. She hugged her subject ecstatically. I'll bet Grandpa doesn't even have any secret treaties. In a few days, everybody on Marduk knew that a treaty with Tanith was being discussed. If they didn't, it was no fault of Zaspar Makan's party, who seemed to command a disconcertingly large number of telecast stations, and who drenched the ether with horror stories of space, Viking atrocities, and denunciations of carefully unnamed traitors surrounding the king and the crown prince who were about to betray Marduk to rapine and plunder. The leak evidently did not come from Cragdale, for it was generally believed that Trask was still at the royal palace in Malverton. At least, that was where the machinists were demonstrating against him. He watched such a demonstration by screen. The pickup was evidently on one of the landing stages of the palace, overlooking the wide park surrounding it. They were packed almost solid with people, surging forward toward the thin cordon of police. The front of the mob looked like a checkerboard, a block in civilian dress, then a block in the curiously effeminate-looking uniforms of Zaspar Makan's peoples. Watchmen, then more in ordinary garb and more people's watchmen. Over the heads of the crowds at intervals floated small contragravity lifters on which were mounted the amplifiers that were bellowing. Space Viking, go home. Space Viking, go home. The police stood motionless at parade rest. The mob surged closer. When they were 50 yards away, the blocks of people's watchmen ran forward, then spread out until they formed a line 6 deep across the entire front. Other blocks, from the rear, pushed the ordinary demonstrators aside and took their place. Hating them more every second, Trask grudged approval of a smart and disciplined maneuver. How long, he wondered, had they been drilling in that sort of tactics? Without stopping, they continued their advance on the police, who had now shifted their stance. Space Viking, go home. Space Viking. Go home. Fire, he heard himself yelling. Don't let them get any closer. Fire now. They had nothing to fire with, they had only truncheons, no better weapons than the knobbed swagger sticks of the People's Watchmen. They simply disappeared after a brief flurry of blows, and the Mackin stormtroopers continued their advance. And that was that. The gates of the palace were shut. The mob, behind a front of Mackin People's Watchmen, surged up to them and stopped. The loudspeakers bellowed on, reiterating their four-word chant. "Those police were murdered," he said. "They were murdered by the man who ordered them out there unarmed." "That would be Count Nadnair, the Minister of Security," somebody said. "Then he's the one you want to hang for it." "What else would you have done?" Crown Prince Edvard challenged. "Put up about 50 combat cars, drawn a deadline, and open machine gun. Fire as soon as the mob crossed it, and kept on firing till the survivors turned tail and ran. Then sent out more cars, and shot everybody wearing a People's Watchman uniform, all over town. Inside 48 hours, there'd be no People's Welfare Party, and no Zaspar Mackin either." The Crown Prince's face stiffened. "That may be the way you do things in the Sword Worlds, Prince Trask. It's not the way we do things here. On Marduk, our government does not propose to be guilty of shedding the blood of its people." He had it on the tip of his tongue to retort that if they didn't, the people would end by shedding theirs. Instead, he said softly, "I'm sorry, Prince Edvard. You had a wonderful civilization here on Marduk. You could have made almost anything of it, but it's too late now. You've torn down the gates the barbarians are in." The colored turbulence faded into the gray of hyperspace, 500 hours to Tanith. Gwot Kirby was securing his control panel, happy to return to his music, and Van Larch would go back to his paints and brushes, and Alvin Carford to the working model of whatever it was he had left unfinished when the Nemesis had emerged at the end of the jump from Audhumla. Trask went to the index of the ship's library and punched for history, Old Terran. There was Plent. Of that, thanks to Otto Harkaman. Then he punched for Hitler Adolf. Harkaman was right. Anything that could happen in a human society had already happened in one form or another somewhere and at some time. Hitler could help him understand Zaspar Mackin by the time the ship came out with the yellow sun of Tanith in the middle of the screen. He knew a great deal about Hitler, occasionally referred to as Skickelgruber, and he understood. With sorrow, how the lights of civilization on Marduk were going out. Beside the Lamia, stripped of her Dillingams and crammed with heavy armament and detection instruments, the Space Scourge and the Queen Flavia were on off-planet watch. There were half a dozen other ships on orbit just above atmosphere, a Gilgameshire, one of the Graham Tanith freighters, a couple of freelance Space Vikings, and a new and unfamiliar ship. When he asked the moon base who she was, he was told that she was the sun goddess Amaterasu. That was, by almost a year, better than he had expected of them. Otto Harkaman was out in the Coruscant, raiding and visiting the trade planets. He found his cousin Nikolay Trask at Rivington. When he inquired about Traskin, Nikolay cursed. "I don't know anything about Traskin. I haven't anything to do with Traskin anymore. Traskin is now the personal property of our well-loved, very well-loved Queen Evita. The Trasks don't own enough land on Graham now for a family cemetery. You see what you did," he added bitterly. "You needn't rub it in, Nikolay. If I'd stayed on Graham, I'd have helped put Angus on the throne, and it would have been about the same in the end." "It could be a lot different," Nikolay said. "You could bring your ships and men back to Graham and put yourself on the throne." "No, I'll never go back to Graham. Tanith's my planet now, but I will renounce my allegiance to Angus. I can trade on Morglay or Joyous or Flamberge just as easily." "You won't have to. You can trade with New Haven and Bigelasport. Count Lionel and Duke Joris are both defying Angus. They've refused to furnish him men. They've driven out his tax collectors, those they haven't hanged, and they're building ships of their own. Angus is building ships, too. I don't know whether he's going to use them to fight Bigelasport and New Haven or attack you, but there's going to be a war before another year's out." The Good Hope and the Speedwell, he found, had gone back to Graham. They were commanded by men who had come into favor at the court of King Angus recently. The Black Star and the Queen Flavia, whose captain had contemptuously ignored an order from Graham to rechristen. Queen Evita had remained. They were his ships, not King Angus. The captain of the merchantman from Wardshaven, now on orbit, refused to take a cargo to New Haven. He had been chartered by King Angus and would take orders from no one else. "All right," Trask told him. "This is your last voyage here. You bring that ship back under Angus of Wardshaven's charter and we'll fire on her." Then he had the regalia he had worn in his last audiovisual to Angus dusted off. At first, he had decided to proclaim himself King of Tanith. Lord Valpry, Baron Rathmore, and his cousin all advised against it. "Just call yourself Prince of Tanith," Valpry said. "The title won't make any difference in your authority here, and if you do lay claim to the throne of Graham, nobody can say you're a foreign king trying to annex the planet." He had no intention of doing anything of the kind, but Valpry was quite in earnest, so he sat on his throne as sovereign Prince of Tanith and renounced his allegiance to Angus, Duke of Wardshaven, self-styled King of Graham. They sent it back on the otherwise empty freighter. Another copy went to the Count of Newhaven, along with a cargo in the Sun Goddess, the first non-Space Viking ship into Graham from the old Federation. 750 hours after the turn of the Nemesis, the Coruscant Roman II emerged from her last microjump, and immediately Harkonnen began hearing of the Battle of Audhumla and the destruction of the Yo-Yo and the Enterprise. At first, he merely reported a successful raiding voyage from which he was bringing rich booty. Oddly variegated booty, it was remarked when he began itemizing it. "Why, yes," he replied. "Second-hand booty. I raided Dagon." For it, Dagon was a Space Viking base planet occupied by a character named Fedric Baragon. A number of ships operated from it, including a couple commanded by Baragon's half-breed sons. "Baragon's ships were raiding one of our planets," Harkonnen said. "Ganpat. They looted a couple of cities, destroyed one, killed a lot of the locals. I found out about it from Captain Ravallo of the Black Star on Indra. He'd just been for Ganpat. Beowulf wasn't too far out of the way, so we put in there and found the Grendelsbane just ready to space out. The Grendelsbane was the second of Beowulf's ships, sister to the Vikings' gift. So she joined us, and the three of us went to Dagon. We blew up one of Baragon's ships and put the other one down out of commission, and then we sacked his base. There was a Gilgameshire colony there. We didn't bother them. They'll tell what we did and why." "That should furnish Prince Victor of Xochitl something to ponder," Trask said. "Where are the other ships now?" "The Grendelsbane went back to Beowulf. She'll stop at Amaterasu to do a little trading on the way. The Black Star went to Xochitl, just a friendly visit to say hello to Prince Victor for you. Ravallo has a lot of audiovisuals we made during the Dagon operation. Then she's going to Jagannath to visit Nikki Gratham." Harkonnen approved his attitude and actions with regard to King Angus. "We don't need to do business with the Sword Worlds at all. We have our own industries, we can produce what we need, and we can trade with Beowulf and Amaterasu, and with Xochitl and Jagannath and Hoth, if we can make any sort of agreement with them. Everybody agrees to let everybody else's trade planets alone. It's too bad you couldn't get some kind of an agreement with Marduk." Harkonnen regretted that for a few seconds, and then shrugged. "Our grandchildren, if any, will probably be raiding Marduk. You think it'll be like that, don't you? You were there, you saw what's happening. The barbarians are rising, they have a leader, and they're uniting. Every society rests on a barbarian base. The people who don't understand civilization and like it if they did. The hitchhikers. The people who create nothing and who don't appreciate what others have created for them, and who think civilization is something that just exists, and that all they need to do is enjoy what they can understand of it: luxuries, a high living standard, and easy work for high pay. Responsibilities? Phooey. What do they have a government for?" Trask nodded. "And now the hitchhikers think they know more about the car than the people who designed it, so they're going to grab the controls. Zaspar Macken says they can, and he's the leader." He poured a drink from a decanter that had been looted on Pushin. There was a planet where a republic had been overthrown in favor of a dictatorship 4 centuries ago, and the planetary dictatorship had fissioned into a dozen regional dictatorships. And now they were down to the peasant village and craft industry level. "I don't understand it, though. I was reading about Hitler on the way home. I wouldn't be surprised if Zaspar Macken had been reading about Hitler, too. He's using all Hitler's tricks. But Hitler came to power in a country which had been impoverished by a military defeat. Marduk hasn't fought a war in almost 2 generations, and that one was a farce. It wasn't the war that put Hitler into power. It was a fact that the ruling class of his nation, the people who kept things running, were discredited. The masses, the homemade barbarians, didn't have anybody to take their responsibilities for them. What they have on Marduk is a ruling class that has been discrediting itself. A ruling class that's ashamed of its privileges and shirks its duties. A ruling class that has begun to believe that the masses are just as good as they are, which they manifestly are not. And a ruling class that won't use force to maintain its position. And they have a democracy, and they are letting the enemies of democracy shelter themselves behind democratic safeguards. We don't have any of this democracy in the sword worlds, if that's the word for it, he said. And our ruling class aren't ashamed of their power, and our people aren't hitchhikers, and as long as they get decent treatment, they don't try to run things, and we're not doing so well. The Morglay dynastic war of a couple of centuries ago, still sputtering and smoking. The Oscarson-Elmerson war on Durandal, into which Flamberge and now Joyous had intruded, and the situation on Graham, fast approaching critical mass. Harkaman nodded agreement. You know why? Our rulers are the barbarians among us. There isn't one of them. Napoleon of Flamberge, Rodolph of Excalib. Or Angus of about half of Graham, who is devoted to civilization or anything else outside himself, and that's the mark of the barbarian. What are you devoted to, Otto? You are my chieftain. That's another mark of the barbarian. Before he had left Marduk, Admiral Schefter had ordered a ship to Gimli to check on the honest Horus. A few men and a pinnace would be left behind to contact any ship from Tanith. He sent Bo Valkenhayn off in the Space Scourge. Lionel of New Haven's Blue Comet came in from Graham with a cargo of general merchandise. Her captain wanted fissionables and gadolinium. Count Lionel was building more ships. There was a rumor that Omfrey of Glasspithe was laying claim to the throne of Graham, in the right of his great-grandmother's sister, who had been married to the great-grandfather of Duke Angus. It was a completely trivial and irrelevant claim, but the story was that it would be supported by King Conrad of Haltekler. Immediately, Baron Rathmore, Lord Valpry, Lothar F. Fail, and the other Graham people began clamoring that he should go back with a fleet and seize the throne for himself. Harkaman, Valkenhayn, Carford, and the other Space Vikings were as vehement against it. Harkaman had the loss of the other Coruscant on Durandal to remember, and the others wanted no art in Sword World squabbles, and there was renewed agitation that he should start calling himself King of Tanith. He refused to do either, which left both parties dissatisfied. So partisan politics had finally come to Tanith. Maybe that was another milestone of progress. And there was the Treaty of Khepra between the princely state of Tanith, the Commonwealth of Beowulf, and the Planetary League of Amaterasu. The Kheperans agree to allow bases on their planet, to furnish workers, and to send students to school on all 3 planets. Tanith, Beowulf, and Amaterasu obligated themselves to joint defense of Khepra, to free trade among themselves, and to render one another armed assistance. That was a milestone of progress, and no argument about it. The Space Scourge returned from Gimli, and Valkenhayn reported that nobody on the planet had ever seen or heard of the honest Horus. They had found a Marjukan Navy ship's pinnace there, manned entirely by officers, some of them Navy intelligence. According to them, the investigation into the activities of that ship had come to an impasse. The ostensible owners claimed, and had papers to prove it, that they had chartered her to a private trader, and he claimed, and had papers to prove it, that he was a citizen of the Planetary Republic of Ata. And as soon as they began questioning him, he was rescued by the Etonian ambassador, who lodged a vehement protest with the Marjukan Foreign Ministry. Immediately, the People's Welfare Party had leaped into the incident and branded the investigation as an unwarranted persecution of a national of a friendly power at the instigation of corrupt tools of the Gilgamesh interstellar conspiracy. So that's it, Valkenhayn finished. They're having an election, and they're afraid to antagonize anybody who might have a vote. So the Navy had to drop the investigation. Everybody on Marduk's scared of this Macan. You think there might be some tie-up between him and Dunnan. The ideas occurred to me. Have there been any more raids on Marduk trade planets since the Battle of Audhumla? A couple. The Bolide was on Audhumla a while ago. There were a couple of Marjuka and ships there, and they had the Victrix fixed up enough to do some fighting. They ran the Bolide out. a study of the time between the destruction of the Enterprise and Yo-Yo and the appearance of the Bolide could give them a limiting radius around Audhumla. It did, 700 light-years, which also included Tanith. So he sent Harkaman in the Coruscant and Ravallo in the Black Star to visit the planets Marduk traded with, looking for Dunnan ships and exchanging information and assistance with the Royal Marjukan Navy. Almost at once, he regretted it. The next Gilgameshire into orbit on Tanith brought a story that Prince Victor was collecting a fleet on Xochitl. He sent warnings off to Amaterasu and Beowulf and Kepra. A ship came in from Bigelasport, a heavily armed chartered freighter. There was sporadic fighting in a dozen places on Graham, now Rhys. Distance to efforts on the part of King Angus to collect taxes, and raids by unidentified persons on estates confiscated from alleged traitors and given to Garvan Spasso, who had now been promoted from Baron to Count. And Ravard Groffies was dead, poisoned, everybody said, either by Spasso or Queen Evita or both. Even with the threat from Xochitl, some of the former Wardshaven nobles began talking about sending ships to Graham. Less than 1,000 hours after he had left, Ravallo was back in the Black Star. I went to Gimli, and I wasn't there 50 hours before a Marjukan Navy ship came in. They were glad to see me. It saved them sending off a pinnace for Tanith. They had news for you and a couple of passengers. Passengers? Yes, you'll see who they are when they come down, and don't let anybody with side whiskers and buttoned-up coats see them. Ravallo said, what those people know gets all over the place before long. The visitors were Lucille, Princess Bentrick and her son, the young Count of Ravery. They dined with Trask. Only Captain Ravallo was also present. I didn't want to leave my husband, and I didn't want to come here and impose myself and Stephen on you, Prince Trask, she began. But he insisted. We spent the whole voyage to Gimli concealed in the captain's quarters. Only a few of the officers knew we were aboard. Mackan won the election. Is that it? He asked. And Prince Bentrick doesn't want to risk you and Stephen being used as hostages. That's it, she said. He didn't really win the election, but he might as well have. Nobody has a majority of seats in the Chamber of Representatives, but he's formed a coalition with several of the splinter parties, and I'm ashamed to say that a number of Crown Loyalist members, crowd of disloyalists, I call them, are voting with him now. They've coined some ridiculous phrase about the wave of the future, whatever that means. If you can't lick them, join them, Trask said. If you can't lick them, lick their boots, the Count of Ravery put in. My son is a trifle bitter, Princess Bentrick said. I must confess to a trace of bitterness, too. Well, that's the representatives. Trask said, what about the rest of the government? With the Splinter Party and disloyalist support, they got a majority of seats in the delegates. Most of them would have indignantly denied a month before having any connection with Mackan, but 100 out of 120 are his supporters. Mackan, of course, is Chancellor. And who is Prime Minister? He asked. Andray Dunnan? She looked slightly baffled for an instant, then said, Oh, no, the Prime Minister is Crown Prince Edvard. No, Baron Cragdale. That isn't a royal title, so by some kind of a fiction I can't pretend to understand he is not Prime Minister as a member of the royal family. If you can't, the boy started. Stephen, I forbid you to say that about Baron Cragdale. He believes very sincerely that the election was an expression of the will of the people, and that it is his duty to bow to it. He wished Otto Harkaman were there. He could probably name, without stopping for breath, 100 great nations that went down into rubble because their rulers believed that they should bow instead of rule, and couldn't bring themselves to shed the blood of their people. Edvard would have been a fine and admirable man as a little country baron. Where he was a disaster. He asked if the People's Watchmen had dragged their guns out from under the bed and started carrying them in public yet. Oh yes, you were quite right, they were armed all the time, not just small arms, combat vehicles, and heavy weapons. As soon as the new government was formed, they were given status as a part of the planetary armed forces. They have taken over every police station on the planet. And the king? Oh, he carries on and shrugs and says, I just reign here. What else can he? Ooh, we've been whittling down and filching away the powers of the throne for the last 3 centuries. What is Prince Bentrick doing, and why did he think there was danger that you two would be used as hostages? He's going to fight, she said. Don't ask me how or what with. Maybe as a gorilla in the mountains, I don't know. But if he can't lick them, he won't join them. I wanted to stay with him and help him. He told me I'd help him best by placing myself and Stephen where he wouldn't worry about us. I wanted to stay, the boy said. I could have fought with him, but he said that I must take care of Mother, and if he were killed, I must be able to avenge him. You talk like a sword worlder. I told you that once before. He hesitated, then turned again to Princess Bentrick. How's little Princess Minna? He asked, and then, trying to be casual, added, and Lady Valerie. She seemed so clearly real and present to him, blue eyes and space-black hair, more real than Elaine had been to him for years. They're at Cragdale. They'll be safe there, I hope. Tempting to conceal the presence on Tanith of Prince Bentrick's wife and son was pushing caution beyond necessity. Admitted that the news would leak back to Marduk via Gilgamesh. It was over 700 light-years to the latter and almost 1,000 from there to the former. Better that Princess Lucille should enjoy Rivington society, such as it was, and escape for a moment now and then from anxiety about her husband. At 10, no, almost 12, it had been a year and a half since Trask had left Marduk. The boy Count of Ravery was more easily diverted. At last, he was among real Space Vikings on a Space Viking planet, and he was trying to be where and see everything at once. No doubt he would be imagining himself a Space Viking, returning to Marduk with a vast armada to rescue his father and the king from Zaspar Makan. Trask was satisfied with that. As a host, he left much to be desired. He had his worries, too, and all of them bore the same name, Prince Victor of Xochitl. He went over with Manfred Ravallo everything the captain of the Black Star could tell him. He had talked once with Victor. The Lord of Xochitl had been coldly polite and non-committal. His subordinates had been frankly hostile. There had been 5 ships on orbit, or landed at Victor's spaceport, beside the usual Gilgameshers and itinerant traders, 2 of them Victor's own, and a big armed freighter had come in from Haltekler as the Black Star was leaving. There was considerable activity at the shipyards and around the spaceport, as though in preparation for something on a large scale. Xochitl was 1,000 light-years from Tanith. He rejected immediately the idea of launching a preventative attack. His ships might reach Xochitl to find it undefended, and then return to find Tanith devastated. Things like that had happened in Space War. The only thing to do was sit tight, defend Tanith when Victor attacked, and then counterattack if he had any ships left. By that time, Prince Victor was probably reasoning in the same way. He had no time to think about Andray Dunnan, except now and then, to wish that Otto Harkaman would stop thinking about him and bring the Coruscant home. He needed that ship on Tanith and the wits and courage of her commander. More news, Gilgamesh sources, came in from Xochitl. There were only 2 ships, both armed merchantmen, on the planet. Prince Victor had paced out with the rest an estimated 2,000 hours before the story reached him. That was twice as long as it would take the Xochitl armada to reach Tanith. He hadn't gone to Beowulf. That was only 65 hours from Tanith, and they would have heard about it long ago. Or Amaterasu or Kepra. How many ships he had was a question, not fewer than 5 and possibly more. He could have slipped into the Tanith system and hidden his ships on one of the outer uninhabitable planets. He sent Valkenhayn and Ravallo micro-jumping their ships from one to another to check. They returned to report in the negative. At least, Victor of Xochitl wasn't camped inside their own system, waiting for them to leave Tanith open to attack. But he was somewhere, and up to nothing even resembling good, and there was no possible way of guessing when his ships would be emerging off. In Tanith, the only thing to do was wait for him. When he did, Trask was confident that he would emerge from hyperspace into serious trouble. He had the Nemesis, the Space Scourge, the Black Star and Queen Flavia, the strongly rebuilt Lamia, and several independent Space Viking ships, among them the damned thing of his friend Roger Fanmorval Estherson, who had volunteered to stay and help in the defense. This, of course, was not pure altruism. If Victor attacked and had his fleet blown to MC Square, Xochitl would lie open and unprotected, and there was enough loot on Xochitl to cram everybody's ships. Everybody's ships who had ships when the Battle of Tanith was over, of course. He was apologetic to Princess Bentrick. I'm very sorry you jumped out of Zaspar Makan's frying pan into Prince Victor's fire, he began. She laughed at that. I'll take my chance. This is on the fire. I seem to see a lot of good firemen around. If there is a battle, you will see that Stephen's in a safe place, won't you? In a space attack, there are no safe places. I'll keep him with me. The young Count of Ravery wanted to know which ship he would serve on when the attack came. Well, you won't be on any ship, Count. You'll be on my staff. 2 days later, the Coruscant came out of hyperspace. Harkonnen was guarded. Non-committal by screen. Trask took a landing craft and went out to meet the ship. Marduk doesn't like us anymore, Harkonnen told him. They have ships on all their trade planets, and they all have orders to fire on any Space Vikings, including the ships of the self-styled Prince of Tanith. I got this from Captain Garavay of the Vindex. After we were through talking, we fought a nice little ship-to-ship action for him to make films of. I don't think anybody could see anything wrong with it. This order came from Makan, from the Admiral commanding. He isn't your friend Schefter. Schefter retired on account of, quote, ill health, unquote. He is now in a, quote, hospital, unquote. Where's Prince Bentrick? Nobody knows. Charges of high treason were brought against him, and he just vanished. Gone underground or secretly arrested and executed, take or choice. He wondered just what he'd tell Princess Lucille and Count Stephen. They have ships on all the planets they trade with, 14 of them. That isn't to catch Dunnan. That's to disperse the Navy away from Marduk. They don't trust the Navy. Is Prince Edvard still Prime Minister? Yes, as of Garavay's last information. It seems Makan is behaving in a scrupulously legal manner outside of making his people's watchmen parta. The armed forces, protesting his devotion to the king every time he opens his mouth. When will the fire be, I wonder? Oh yes, you were reading up on Hitler. That I don't know. Probably happened by now. He just told Princess Lucille that her husband had gone into hiding. He couldn't be sure whether she was relieved or more worried. The boy was sure that he was doing something highly romantic and heroic. Some of the volunteers. Tired of waiting after another 1,000 hours and spaced out. The Vikings' gift of Beowulf came in with a cargo and went on orbit after discharging it to join the watch. A Gilgameshire came in from Amaterasu and reported everything quiet there. As soon as her captain had sold his cargo, with a minimum of haggling, he spaced out again. His behavior convinced everybody that the attack would come in a matter of hours. It didn't. 1,000 hours had passed since the first warning had reached Tanith, that made 5,000 since Victor's ships were supposed to have left Xochitl. There were those, Boak Valkenhayn among them, who doubted now if he ever had. The whole thing's just a big Gilgameshire lie, he was declaring. Somebody, Nicky Gratham or the Everards or maybe Victor himself, paid them to tell us that to pin our ships down here. Or they made it up. Themselves so they could make hay on our trade planets. Let's go down to the ghetto and clean out the whole gang, somebody else took up. Anything one of them's in, they're all in together. Niflheim with that, let's all space out for Xochitl, Manfred Ravallo proposed. We have enough ships to lick them on Tanith, we have enough to lick them on their own planet. He managed to talk them out of both courses of action. What was he, How, sovereign prince of Tanith, or the non-ruling king of Marduk, or just the chieftain of a disciplineless gang of barbarians? One of the independents spaced out in disgust. The next day, 2 others came in, loaded with booty from a raid on Bragi, and decided to stay around for a while and see what happened. And 4 days after that, a 500-foot hyperspace yacht, bearing the daggers and chevrons of Bigalasport, came in. As soon as she was out of the last microjump, she began calling by screen. Trask didn't know the man who was screening, but Hugh Rathmore did. Duke Joris' confidential secretary. Prince Trask, I must speak to you as soon as possible, he began, almost stuttering. Whatever the urgency of his mission, one would have thought that a 3,000-hour voyage would have taken some of the edge from it. It is of the first importance. You are speaking to me? This screen is reasonably secure, and if it's of the first importance, the sooner you tell me about it. Prince Trask, you must come to Graham with every man and every ship you can command. Satan only knows what's happening there now, but 3,000 hours ago, when the Duke sent me off, Omfrey of Glaspithe was landing on Wardshaven. He has a fleet of 8 ships, furnished to him by his wife's kinsman, the king. Of Haltekler, they are commanded by King Conrad's Space Viking cousin, the Prince of Xochitl. Then a look of shocked surprise came into the face of the man in the screen, and Trask wondered why, until he realized that he had leaned back in his chair and was laughing uproariously. Before he could apologize, the man in the screen had found his voice. I know, Prince Trask, you have no reason to think kindly of King Angus, the former King Ang. Gus, or maybe even the late King Angus, I suppose he is now. But a murderer like Omfrey of Glasspythe? It took a little time to explain to the confidential secretary of the Duke of Bigglesport the humor of the situation. There were others at Rivington to whom it was not immediately evident. The professional Space Vikings, men like Valkenhayn and Ravallo and Alvin Carford, were disgusted. Here they'd been sitting on combattle all these months, and if they'd only known, they could have gone to Xochitl and looted it clean long ago. The Graham party were outraged. Angus of Wardshaven had been bad enough, with the hereditary taint of the mad Baron of Blackcliff and Queen Evita and her rapacious family, but even he was preferable to a murderous villain. Some even called him a fiend in human shape, like Omfrey of Glasspythe. Both parties, of course, were positive as to where their prince's duty lay. The former insisted that everything on Tanith that could be put into hyperspace should be dispatched at once to Xochitl, to haul back from it everything except a few absolutely immovable natural features of the planet. The latter clamored, just as loudly and passionately, that everybody on Tanith who could pull a trigger should be embarked at once on a crusade for the deliverance of Graham. You don't want to do either, do you? Harkaman asked him when they were alone after the second day of acrimony. Niflheim, no, this crowd that wants an attack on Xochitl. You know what would happen if we did that? Harkaman was silent, waiting for him to continue. Inside a year, 4 or 5 of these small planet holders like Gratham and the Everards would combine against us and make a slag pile out of Tanith. Harkaman nodded agreement. Since we warned him the first time, Victor's kept his ships away from our planets. If we attacked Xochitl now without provocation, nobody'd know what to expect from us. People like Nicky Gratham and Tobin of Nurgle and the Everards of Hoth get nervous around unpredictable dangers, and when they get nervous, they get trigger-happy. He puffed slowly on his pipe and then said, "Then you'll be going back to Graham. That doesn't Hello, just because Valkenhayn and Ravallo and that crowd are wrong doesn't make Valpry and Rathmore and Fail right. You heard what I was telling those very people at Karvall House the day I met you, and you've seen what's been happening on Graham since we came out here. Otto, the sword worlds are finished. They're half decivilized now. Civilization is alive and growing here on Tanith. I want to stay here and help it grow. Look, Lou. 'Cause Harkaman said, "You're Prince of Tanith and I'm only the Admiral. But I'm telling you, you'll have to do something, or this whole setup of yours will fall apart. As it stands, you can attack Xochitl and the Back to Graham party would go along, or you can decide on this crusade against Omfrey of Glasspythe and the Raid Xochitl now party would go along. But if you let this go on much longer, you won't have any influence over either party, and then I will be finished, and in a few years Tanith will be finished." He rose and paced across the room and back. "Well, I won't raid Xochitl. I told you why, and you agreed. And I won't spend the men and ships and wealth of Tanith in any Sword World dynastic squabble. Great Satan, Otto, you were in the Durandal War. This is the same thing, and it'll go on for another half a century. Then what will you do?" "I came out here after Andray Dunnan, didn't I?" he asked. "I'm afraid Ravallo and Valpry, or even Valkenhayn and Moorland, won't be as interested in Dunnan as you are. Then I will interest them in him. Remember, I was reading up on Hitler coming in from Marduk. I will tell them all a big lie. Such a big lie that nobody will dare to disbelieve it." "Do you think I was afraid of Victor of Xochitl?" he demanded. "Half a dozen ships. We could make a new Van Allen belt around Tanith of them with what we have here. Our real enemy is on Marduk, not Xochitl. His name's Zaspar Makan. Zaspar Makan and Andray Dunnan, the man I came out from Graham to hunt, they're in alliance, and I believe Dunnan is on Marduk himself now." The delegation who had come out from Graham in the yacht of the Duke of Bigglesport were unimpressed. Marduk was only a name to them, one of the fabulous civilized old Federation planets no sword-worlder had ever seen. Zaspar Makan wasn't even that. And so much had happened on Graham since the murder of Elaine Karvall and the piracy of the Enterprise that they had completely forgotten Andray Dunnan. That put them at a disadvantage. All the people whom they were trying to convince, the 100 members of the new nobility of Tanith, spoke a language they didn't understand. They didn't even understand the proposition and couldn't argue against it. Patrick Moorland, who was Graham-born and had been speaking for a return in force to fight against Omfrey of Glasspythe and his supporters, defected from them at once. He had been on Marduk and knew who Zaspar Makan was. He had made friends with the Royal Navy officers and had been shocked to hear that they were now enemies. Manfred Rava, Lo and Boke Valkenhayn, among the more articulate of the Radzotchital now party, snatched up the idea and seemed convinced that they'd thought of it themselves all along. Valkenhayn had been on Gimli and talked to Marjukan naval officers. Ravallo had brought Princess Bentrick to Tanith and heard her stories on the voyage. They began adducing arguments in support of Trask's thesis. Of course, Dunnan and Makan were in collusion. Hooty. Dunnan off that the Victrix would be on Audhumla? Makan, his spies in the Navy, tipped him. What about the honest Horus? Wasn't Makan blocking any investigation about her? Why was Admiral Schefter retired as soon as Makan got into power? Well, here we don't know anything about this Zaspar Makan, the confidential secretary and spokesman of the Duke of Bigelasport began. No, you don't, Otto Harkaman told him. I said, just you keep quiet and listen till you find out a little about him. Why, I wouldn't be surprised if Dunnan was on Marduk all the time we were hunting for him, Valkenhayn said. Trask began to wonder. What would Hitler have done if he'd told one of his big lies and then found it turning into the truth? Maybe Makan had been on Marduk. No, he couldn't have hidden half a dozen ships on a civilized planet. Not even at the bottom of an ocean. I wouldn't be surprised, Alvin Carford was shouting, if Andray Dunnan was Zaspar Makan. I know he doesn't look like Dunnan. We all saw him on screen, but there's such a thing as plastic surgery. That was making the big lie just a trifle too big. Zaspar Makan was 6 inches shorter than Dunnan. There are some things no plastic surgery could do. Patrick Morland, who had known Dunnan and had seen Makan on screen, ought to have known that too, but he either didn't think of it or didn't want to weaken a case he had completely accepted. As far as I can find out, nobody even heard of Makan till about 5 years ago. That would be about the time Dunnan would have arrived on Marduk, he said. By this time, the big room in which they were meeting had become a babel of voices, everybody trying to convince everybody else that they'd known it all along. Then the back-to-Graham party received its coup de grace, Lothar F. Fail, to whom the emissaries of Duke Joris had looked for their strongest support, went over. You people want us to abandon a planet we've built up from nothing and all the time and money we've invested in it to go back to Graham and pull your chestnuts out of the fire. Gehenna with you. We're staying here and defending our own planet. If you're smart, you will stay here with us. The Bigelasport delegation was still on Tanith, trying to recruit mercenaries from the King of Trade Town and dickering with a Gilgameshire to transport them to Graham. When the big lie turned into something like the truth, the observation post on the moon of Tanith picked up an emergence at 20 light minutes due north of the planet. Half an hour later, there was another one at 5 light minutes, a very small one, and a third at 2 light seconds, and this was detectable by radar and microray as a ship's pinnace. He wondered if something had happened on Amaterasu or Beowulf. Somebody like Gratham or the Everards might have decided to take advantage of the defensive mobilization on Tanith. Then they switched the call from the pinnace over to his screen, and Prince Simon Bentrick was looking out of it. I'm glad to see you. Your wife and son are here. Worried about you, but safe and well. He turned to shout to somebody to find young Count Stephen of Ravery and tell him to tell his mother. How are you? I had a broken leg when I left Moonbase, but that's mended on the way, Bentrick said. I have little Princess Mina aboard with me. For all I know, she's Queen of Marduk now. He gulped slightly. Prince Trask, we've come as beggars. We're begging help for our planet. You've as honored guests, and you'll get all the help we can give you. He blessed the Zotchital invasion scare, and the big lie which was rapidly ceasing to be a lie. Tanith had the ships and men and the will to act. What happened? Makan deposed the king and took over? It came to that, Bentrick told him. It had started even before the election. The People's Watchmen had possessed weapons that had been made openly and legally on Marduk for trade to the neo-barbarian planets, and then clandestinely diverted to secret people's welfare arsenals. Some of the police had gone over to Makan. The rest had been terrorized into inaction. There had been riots fomented in working-class districts of all the cities as pretexts for further terrorization. The election had been a farce of bribery and intimidation. Even so, Makan's party had failed of a complete majority in the Chamber of Representatives and had been compelled to patch up a shady coalition in order to elect a favorable Chamber of Delegates. And of course, they elected Macken Chancellor. That did it, Bentrick said. All the opposition leaders in the Chamber of Representatives have been arrested on all kinds of ridiculous charges. Sex crimes, receiving bribes, being in the pay of foreign powers. Nothing too absurd. Then they rammed through a law empowering the Chancellor to fill vacancies in the Chamber of Representatives by appointment. Why did the Crown Prince lend himself to a thing like that? He hoped that he could exercise some control. The royal family is an almost holy symbol to the people. Even Macken was forced to pretend loyalty to the king and the Crown Prince. It didn't work. He played right into Macken's hands. What happened? The Crown Prince had been assassinated. The assassin, an unknown man believed to be a Gilgameshire, had been shot to death by People's Watchmen guarding Prince Edvard at once. Immediately, Macken had seized the royal palace to protect the king, and immediately there had been massacres by People's Watchmen everywhere. The Marjukan planetary army had ceased to exist. Macken's story was that there had been a military plot against the king and the government, scattered over the planet in small detachments. The army had been wiped out in 2 nights and a day. Now Macken was recruiting it up again, exclusively from the People's Welfare Party. You weren't just sitting on your hands, were you? Oh no, Bentrick replied. I was doing something I wouldn't have thought myself capable of a few years ago, organizing a mutineering conspiracy in the Royal Marjukan Navy. After Admiral Schefter was forcibly retired and shut up in an insane asylum, I disappeared and turned into a civilian contragravity lifter operator at the Malverton Navy Yard. Finally, when I was suspected, one of the officers, he was arrested and tortured to death later, managed to smuggle me onto a lighter for the moonbase. I was an orderly in the hospital there. The day the Crown Prince was murdered, we had a mutiny of our own. We killed everybody we even suspected of being a mechanist. The moonbase has been under attack from the planet ever since. There was a stir behind him. Turning, he saw Princess Bentrick and the boy enter the room. He rose. We'll talk about this later. There are some people here. He motioned them forward and turned away, shooing everybody else out of the room. The news was all over Rivington and then all over Tanith while the pinnace was still coming down. There was a crowd at the spaceport, staring as the little craft, with its blazon of the crowned and planet-throned dragon, settled onto its landing legs, and reporters of the Tanith News Service with their screen pickups. He met Prince Bentrick, a little in advance of the others, and managed to whisper to him hastily. While you're talking to anybody here, always remember that Andray Dunnan is working with Zaspar Macken, and as soon as Macken consolidates his position, he's sending an expedition against Tanith. How in blazes did you find that out here? Bentrick demanded. From the Gilgameshires? Then Harkaman and Rathmore and Valkenhayn and Lothar F. Fail and the others were crowding up behind, and more people were coming off the pinnace, and Prince Bentrick was trying to embrace both his wife and his son at the same time. Prince Trask. He started at the voice, and was looking into deep blue eyes under black hair. His pulse gave a sudden jump, and he said, Valerie, and then, Lady Alvarath, I'm most happy to see you here. Then he saw who was beside her and squatted on his heels to bring himself down to a convenient size. And Princess Mina. Welcome to Tanith, Your Highness, the child flung her arms around his neck. Oh, Prince Lucas, I'm so glad to see you. There's been such awful things happened. There won't be anything awful happen here, Princess Mina. You are among friends with whom you have a treaty. Remember, the child began to cry bitterly. That was when I was just a play queen. And now I know what they meant when they talked about when Grandpa and Papa would be through being king. Papa didn't even get to be king. Something big and warm and soft was trying to push between them. A dog with long blonde hair and floppy ears. In a year and a half, puppies can grow surprisingly. Mopsy was trying to lick his face. He took the dog by the collar and straightened. Lady Valerie, will you come with us? He asked. I'm going to find quarters for Princess Mina. Is it Princess Mina or is it Queen Mina? He asked. Prince Bentrick shook his head. We don't know. The king was alive when we left Moonbase, but that was 500 hours ago. We don't know anything about her mother either. She was at the palace when Prince Edvard was murdered. We've heard absolutely nothing about her. The king made a few screen appearances, parroting things Macken wanted him to say, under hypnosis. That was probably the very least of what they did to him. They've turned him into a zombie. Well, how did Mina get to Moonbase? That was Lady Valerie as much as anybody else. She and Sir Thomas Cobley and Captain Rayner, they are. The servants at Cragdale with hunting rifles and everything else they could scrape up, captured Prince Edward's space yacht and took off in her. Took a couple of hits from ground batteries getting off and from ships around Moonbase getting in. Ships of the Royal Margican Navy, he added furiously. The pinnace in which they had made the trip to Tanith had taken a few hits too running the blockade. Not many, her captain had thrown her. Into hyperspace almost at once. They sent the yacht off to Gimli, Bentrick said. From there, they'll try to rally as many of the Royal Navy units as haven't gone over to Macan. They're to assemble on Gimli and await my return. If I don't return in 1500 hours from the time I left Moonbase, they're to use their own judgment. I'd expect that they'd move in on Marduk and attack. That's 60-odd days, Otto Harkamans. Ed, that's an awfully long time to expect that lunar base to hold out against a whole planet. It's a strong base. It was built 400 years ago when Marduk was fighting a combination of 6 other planets. It held out against continuous attack once for almost a year. It's been constantly strengthened ever since. And what have they to throw at it? Harkaman persisted. When I left, 6 ships of the former Royal Navy. It had gone over to Macan. 4 1500-footers, same class as the Victrix, and 2,000-footers. Then there were 4 of Andray Dunnan's ships. You mean he really is on Marduk? I thought you knew that, and I was wondering how you'd found out. Yes, Fortuna, Bolide, and 2 armed merchantmen, a Balder-built ship called the Reliable, and your friend Honest Horus. You didn't really believe Dunnan was on Marduk? Boke. Valkenhayn asked. Actually, I didn't. I had to have some kind of a story to talk those people out of that crusade against Omfrey of Glasspythe. He left unmentioned Valkenhayn's own insistence on a plundering expedition against Xochitl. Now that it turns out to be true, I'm not surprised. We decided long ago that Dunnan was planning to raid Marduk. It appears that we underestimated him. Maybe he was reading about it. Hitler, too. He wasn't planning any raid. He was planning conquest in the only way a great civilization can be conquered, by subversion. Yes, Harkaman put in. 5 years ago, when Dunnan started this program, who was this Macan anyhow? Nobody, Bentrick said. A crackpot agitator in Dreplin. He had a coven of fellow crackpots who met in the back room of a saloon and had their office in a cigar box. The next year, he had a suite of offices and was buying time on a couple of telecasts. The year after that, he had 3 telecast stations of his own and was holding rallies and meetings of thousands of people, and so on, upward. Yes. Dunnan financed him and moved in behind him the same way Macan moved in behind the king, and Dunnan will have him shot the way he had Prince Edvard shot and used the murder as a pretext to liquidate his personal followers. And then he'll own Marduk, and we'll have the Margican Navy coming out of hyperspace on Tanith, Valkenhayn added. So we go to Marduk and smash him now while he's still little enough to smash. There had been a few who had wanted to do that about Hitler, and a great many later who had regretted that it hadn't been done. The Nemesis, the Coruscant, and the Space Scourge for sure? He asked, Harkaman. And Valkenhayn agreed. Valkenhayn thought the Vikings' gift of Beowulf would go along, and Harkaman was almost sure of the Black Star and Queen Flavia. He turned to Bentrick. Start that pinnace off for Gimli at once, within the hour if possible. We don't know how many ships will be gathered there, but we don't want them wasted in detail attacks. Tell whoever's in command there that ships from Tanith are on the way, and to wait for them. 1,500 hours, less the 500 Bentrick was in space from Marduk. He hadn't time to estimate voyage time to Gimli from the other Margican trade planets, and nobody could estimate how many ships would respond. It may take us a little time to get an effective fleet together, even after we get through arguing about it. Argument, he told Bentrick, is not exclusively a feature of democracies. Actually, there was very little argument, and most of that among the Margicans. Prince Bentrick insisted that Crown Princess Mina would have to be taken along. King Mikhill would be either dead or brainwashed into imbecility by now, and they would have to have somebody to take the throne. Lady Valerie Alvarath, Sir Thomas Cobley, the tutor, and the nurse Margaret refused to be separated from her. Prince Bentrick was equally firm with less success. On leaving his wife and son on Tanith, in the end, it was agreed that the entire Margican party would space out on the Nemesis. The leader of the Bigalasport delegation attempted an impassioned tirade about going to the aid of strangers while their own planet was being enslaved. He was booed down by everybody else, and informed that Tanith was being defended where a planet ought to be, on somebody else's real estate. When the big Gulasporters emerged from the meeting, they found that their own space yacht had been commandeered and sent off to Amaterasu and Beowulf for assistance, that the regiment of local infantry they had enlisted from the King of Trade Town had been taken over by the Rivington authorities, and that the Gilgamish freighter they had chartered to transport them to Graham would now take them to Marduk. The problem broke into two halves: the purely naval action that would be fought to relieve the moon of Marduk, if it still held out, and to destroy the Dunnan and Mackin ships, and the ground-fighting problem of wiping out Mackin's supporters and restoring the Marjukan monarchy. A great many of the people of Marduk would be glad of a chance to turn on Mackin, once they had arms and were properly supported. Combat weapons were almost unknown among the people, however, and even sporting arms in common. All the small arms and light artillery and auto weapons available were gathered up. The Grendelsbane came in from Beowulf, and the Sun Goddess from Amaterasu. 3 independent Space Viking ships were still in orbit on Tanith. They joined the expedition. There would be trouble with them on Marduk. They'd want to loot. Let the Marjukans worry about that. They could charge it off as part of the price for letting Zaspar Mac and get into power in the first place. There were 12 spacecraft in line outside the moon of Tanith, counting the 3 independents and the forcibly chartered Gilgameshire troop transport. That was the biggest fleet Space Vikings had ever assembled in their history. Alvin Carford said as much while they were checking the formation by screen. It isn't a Space Viking fleet, Prince Bentrick differed. There are only 3 Space Vikings in it. The rest are the ships of 3 civilized planets: Tanith, Beowulf, and Amaterasu. Carford was surprised. You mean we're civilized planets, like Marduk or Baldur or Odin or... Well, aren't you? Trask smiled. He'd begun to suspect something of the sort a couple of years ago. He hadn't really been sure until now. His most junior staff officer, Count Stephen of Ravery, didn't seem to appreciate the compliment. We are Space Vikings, he insisted, and we are going to battle with the neo-barbarians of Zaspar Macan. Well, I won't argue the last half of it, Stephen, his father told him. Are you people done yakking about who's civilized and who isn't? Gwot Kirby asked. Then give the signal. All the other ships are ready to jump. Trask pressed the button on the desk in front of him. A light went on over Kirby's control panel as one would on each of the other ships. He said, jumping, around the stem of his pipe and twisted the red handle and shoved it in. 450 hours in the private universe that was the Nemesis. Outside, nothing else existed, and inside there was nothing to do but wait, as each hour carried them 6 trillion miles nearer to Gimli. At first, the ruthless and terrible Space Viking Stephen, Count of Ravery, was wildly excited. But before long, he found that there was nothing exciting going on. It was just a spaceship, and he'd been on ships before. Her Highness the Crown Princess, or maybe Her Majesty the Queen of Marduk, stopped being excited about the same time, and she and Stephen and Mopsy played together. Of course, Minna was only a girl, and 2 years younger than Stephen, but she was, or at least might be, his sovereign, and besides, she had been. In a space action, if you call what lies between a planet and its satellite space, and if you call being shot at without being able to shoot back an action, and relentless Ravery, the interstellar terror, had not. This rather made up for being a girl and a mere baby of going on 10. One thing, there were no lessons. Sir Thomas Cobley fancied himself as a landscape painter and spent most of his time arguing techniques with Van Laar. And Stephen's tutor, Captain Rayner, was a normal space astrogator and found a kindred spirit in Charles Renner. This left Lady Valerie Alvarath at a loose end. There were plenty of volunteers to help her fill in the time, but rank hath its privileges. Trask undertook to see to it that she did not suffer excessively from shipboard ennui. Charles Renner and Captain Rayner approached him, during the cocktail hour before dinner, some hunned. It hours short of emergence. We think we've figured out where Dunnan's base is, Renner said. Oh, good. Everybody else had on a different planet. Where's yours? Abaddon, the Count of Ravery's tutor said. When he saw that the name meant nothing to Trask, he added, the 9th outer planet of the Marduk system. He said it disgustedly. Yes, remember how you had Boak and Manfred out with their ships, checking our outside planets to see. Prince Victor might be hiding on one of them. Well, what with the time element, and the way the honest Horus was shuttling back and forth from Marduk to some place that wasn't Gimli, and the way Dunnan was able to bring his ships in as soon as the shooting started on Marduk, we thought he must be on an uninhabited outer planet of the Marduk system. I don't know why we never thought of that ourselves, Rayner put in. I suppose. Because nobody ever thinks of Abaddon for any reason. It's only a small planet, about 4,000 miles in diameter, and it's 3.5 billion miles from primary. It's frozen solid. It would take almost a year to get to it on Abbott Drive, and if your ship has Dillinghams, why not take a little longer and go to a good planet? So nobody bothered with Abaddon. But for Dunnan's purpose, it would be perfect. He called. Prince Bentrick and Alvin Carford to him. They found the idea instantly convincing. They talked about it through dinner and held a general discussion afterward. Even Gwat Kirby, the ship's pessimist, could find no objection to it. Trask and Bentrick began at once making battle plans. Carford wondered if they hadn't better wait till they got to Gimli and discuss it with the others. No, Trask told him. This is the flagship. Here's where the strategy is decided. Well, how about the Margican Navy? Captain Rayner asked. I think Fleet Admiral Bargam's in command at Gimli. Prince Simon Bentrick was silent for a moment, as though he realized with reluctance that the big decision was no longer avoidable. He may be at present, but he won't be when I get there. I will be. But, Your Highness, he's a fleet admiral. You're just a commodore. I am not just a commodore. The king is a prisoner and for all we know dead. The crown prince is dead. The Princess Mina is a child. I am assuming the position of regent and prince protector of the realm. There was a little difficulty on Gimli with Fleet Admiral Bargam. Commodores didn't give orders to fleet admirals. Well, maybe regents did, but who gave Prince Bentrick authority to call himself regent? Regents were elected by the Chamber of Delegates on nomination of the Chancellor. That's Zaspar Makan and his stooges you're talking about, Bentrick laughed. Well, the Constitution? He thought better of that before somebody asked him what Constitution. Well, a regent has to be chosen by election. Even members of the royal family can't just make themselves regent by saying they are. I can, I just have, and I don't think there are going to be many or elections, at least for the present. Not till we make sure the people of Marduk can be trusted with the control of the government. Well, the pinnace from Moonbase reported that there were 6 Royal Navy battleships and 4 other craft attacking them, Bargam objected. I only have 4 ships here. I sent for the ones on the other trade planets, but I haven't heard from any of them. We can't go there with only 4 ships. 16. Ips, Bentrick corrected. No, 15 and 1 Gilgameshire we're using for a troopship. I think that's enough. You'll remain here on Gimli in any case, Admiral. As soon as the other ships come in, you'll follow to Marduk with them. I'm now holding a meeting aboard the Tanith flagship Nemesis. I want your 4 ship commanders aboard immediately. I am not including you because you're remaining here to bring up the late comers, and as soon as this meeting is over, we are spacing out. Actually, they spaced out sooner. The meeting lasted the whole 350 hours to Abaddon. A ship's captain, if he has a good exec, as all of them had, needs only sit at his command desk and look important while the ship is going into and emerging from a long jump. The rest of the time he can study ancient history or whatever his shipboard hobby is, rather than waste 350 hours of precious time. Each captain turned his ship over to his exec and remained aboard the Nemesis. Even on so spacious a craft, the officers' country north of the engine rooms was crowded like a tourist hotel in mid-season. One of the 4 Margicans was the Captain Garave who had smuggled Bentrick's wife and son off Marduk, and the other 3 were just as pro-Bentrick, pro-Tanith, and anti-Makan. They were, Anja. General principles, also anti-Bargam. There must be something wrong with any fleet admiral who remained in his command after Zaspar Makan came to power. So, as soon as they spaced out, there was a party. After that, they settled down to planning the Battle of Abaddon. There was no Battle of Abaddon. It was a dead planet, one side in night and the other in dim twilight from the little speck of a sun 3.5 billion miles away. Jagged. Mountains rising out of the snow that covered it from pole to pole. The snow on top would be frozen CO2. According to the thermocouples, the surface temperature was well below -100 centigrade. No ships on orbit circled it. There was a little faint radiation, which could have been from naturally radioactive minerals. There was no electrical discharge detectable. There was considerable bad language in the command of the Nemesis. The captains of the other ships were screening in, wanting to know what to do. "Go on in," Trask told them. "Englobe the planet and go down to within a mile if necessary. They could be hiding somewhere on it." "Well, they're not hiding at the bottom of any ocean, that's for sure," somebody said. It was one of those feeble jokes at which everybody laughs because nothing else is laughable about the situation. Finally, they found it at the North Pole, which was no colder than anywhere else on the planet. First, radiation leakage, the sort that would come from a closed-down nuclear power plant. Then a modicum of electrical discharge. Finally, the telescopic screens picked up the spaceport, a huge oval amphitheater excavated out of a valley between two jagged mountain ranges. The language in the command room was just as bad, but the tone had changed. It was surprising what a wide range of emotions could be expressed by a few simple blasphemies and obscenities. Everybody who had been deriding Charles Renner were now acclaiming him, but it was lifeless. The ships came crowding in. Airlocked landing craft full of space-armored ground fighters went down. Screens in the command room lit as they transmitted in views. Depressions in the carbon dioxide snow where the 100-foot pad feet of ships' landing legs had pressed down. Ranks of cargo lighters that had plied to and from other ships or orbit. And all around the cliff-walled perimeter, airlocked doors to caverns and tunnels. A great many men with a great deal of equipment had been working here in the estimated 5 or 6 years since Andray Dunnan, or somebody, had constructed this base. Andray Dunnan. They found his badge, the crescent, blue on black on things. They found equipment that Harkaman recognized as having been part of the original cargo stolen with the Enterprise. They even found, in his living quarters, a blown-up photoprint picture of Neville Orme, draped in black. But what they did not find was a single vehicle small enough to be taken aboard a ship, or a single scrap of combat equipment, not even a pistol or a hand grenade. Dunnan had gone, but they knew whither and where to find him. The conquest of Marduk had moved into its final phase. Marduk was on the other side of the sun from Abaddon with 95 million miles, close but not inconveniently so, Trask thought, to spare. Gwat Kirby and the Margican astrogator who was helping him made it within a light minute. The Margican thought that was fine. Kirby didn't. The last microjump was aimed at the moon of Marduk, which was plainly visible in the telescopic screen. They came out within a light second and a half, which Kirby admitted was reasonably close. As soon as the screens cleared, they saw that they weren't too late. The moon of Marduk was under fire and firing back. They'd have detection, and he knew what they were detecting. A clump of 16 rending distortions of the fabric of spacetime as 16 ships came into sudden existence in the normal continuum. Beside him, Bentrick had a screen on. It was still milky white, and he was speaking into a radio hand phone. Simon Bentrick, Prince Protector of Marduk, calling Moonbase. Then, slowly, he repeated his screen combination twice. "Come in, Moonbase. This is Simon Bentrick, Prince Protector, speaking." He waited 10 seconds and was about to start again when the screen flickered. The man who appeared in it wore the insignia of a Marge. Ukan Navy Commodore. He needed a shave, but he was grinning happily. Bentrick greeted him by name. "Hello, Simon. Glad to see you. Your Highness, I mean, what is this Prince Protector thing? Somebody had to do it. Is the king still alive?" The grin slid off the Commodore's face, starting with his eyes. "We don't know." At first, Mackin had him speaking by screen. You know what it was like, urging everybody to obey and cooperate. With our trusted Chancellor, Mackin always appeared on the screen with him. Bentrick nodded. "I remember. Before you left, Mackin kept quiet and let the king make the speech. After a while, the king wasn't able to speak coherently. He'd stammer and repeat. So then Mackin did all the talking. They couldn't even depend on him to parrot what they were giving him with an earplug phone. Then he stopped appearing entirely. I suppose there were physical symptoms they couldn't allow to be seen." Bentrick was cursing horribly under his breath. The officer at Moonbase nodded. "I hope for his sake that he is dead. Poor Goodman Mickhill." Bentrick was saying, "So do I." Trask agreed mentally. The Commodore at Moonbase was still talking. "We got 2 more renegade RMN ships within 100 hours after you left." He named them. "And we got one of the Dunnan ships, the Faw. Fortuna. We blew out the Malverton Navy Yard. They're still using the Antarctic Naval Base, but we've knocked out a good deal of that. We got the honest horrors. They made 2 attempts to land on us and lost a couple of ships. 800 hours ago, they were joined by the rest of Dunnan's fleet, 5 ships. They made a landing on Malverton while it was turned away from us. Mackin announced that they were RMN units from the trade planets that had joined him. I suppose the planet-side public swallowed that. He also announced that their commander, Admiral Dunnan, was in command of the People's Armed Forces. Dunnan's ground fighters would be in control of Malverton. By now, the odds were that Mackin was as much his prisoner as King Mikil Roman VIII had been Mackin's. So Dunnan has conquered Marduk. All he has to do now is make it stick, he said. I see, foe. Our ships off Moonbase, how many more have they? These are Bolide and Eclipse, Dunnan's ships, and former Royal Marjukan Navy ships Champion and Guardian. There are 5 orbiting off the planet. XRMNS Paladin and Dunnan's ships Starhopper, Banshee, Reliable, and Exporter. The last 2 are listed as merchantmen, but they're performing like regulation battlecraft. The 4 that had been circling Moonbase broke orbit and started toward the relieving fleet. One took a hit from a Moonbase missile, which staggered her, but did no evident damage. 2 ships which had been orbiting the planet also changed course and started out. The command room was silent, except for a subdued chuckling from a computer, which was estimating enemy intentions by observed data and games theory. 3 more came hurrying out from the planet, and the 2 in the lead slowed. To let them catch up. He wanted to be able to engage the 4 from off the satellite before the 5 from the planet joined them, but Carford's computers said it couldn't be done. All right, we have to take all our bad eggs in one basket, he said. Try to hit them as soon after they join as possible. The computers began chuckling again. The serving robots were doing a rush business in hot coffee. Prince Bentrick's son, sitting aside his father, had stopped being ruthless Ravery the demon of the spaceways and was a very young officer going into his first space battle, more scared and at the same time happier than he had ever been in his short life. Captain Garavay of the Vindex was making signal to the other ships from Gimli. Royal Navy, smash the traitors first? He could understand and sympathize, even if he couldn't approve of putting personal ahead of tact. Ickle considerations, and made a quick sealed beam call to Harkaman to be prepared to plug any holes they left in formation if they broke away in search of vengeance. He also ordered the Black Star and the Sun Goddess to shepherd the lightly armed and troop-crammed Gilgamish freighter out of danger. The 2 clumps of Dunnan Mackin ships were converging rapidly, and Alvin Carford was screaming into a phone to somebody to get more speed. At 1,000 miles, the missiles started going out, and the 2 groups of ships, 4 and 5, were equidistant from each other and from the Allied fleet, at the points of a triangle that was growing smaller by the second. The first fire globes of intercepted missiles spread from their seeds of brief white light. A red light flashed on the damage board. An enemy ship took a hit. The captain of the Queen Flavia was on a screen, saying that his ship was heavily damaged. 3 ships bearing the Marjukan Dragonan planet circled madly around each other at what looked in the screen like just over pistol range, 2 of them firing into the 3rd, which was replying desperately. The 3rd one blew up, and somebody was yelling out of a screen speaker, "Scratch one traitor." Another ship blew up somewhere, and then another. He heard somebody say, "There went one of ours," and wondered which one it was. Not the Coruscant, he hoped. No, it wasn't. He could see her rushing after 2 other ships which were, in turn, speeding toward the Black Star, the Sun Goddess, and the Gilgamish freighter. Then the Nemesis and the Starhopper were within gun range, pounding each other savagely. The battle had tied itself into a ball of gyrating, fire-spitting ships that went rolling toward the planet, which was swinging in and out of the main view screen and growing rapidly larger. By the time they were down to the inner edge of the exosphere, the ball had started to unwind, ship after ship dropping out of it and going into orbit, some badly damaged and some going to attack damaged enemies. Some of them were completely around the planet, hidden by it. He saw 3 ships approaching Coruscant, Sun Goddess, and the Gilgamisher. He got Harkaman on the screen. "Where's the Black Star?" he asked. "Gone to MC Square," Harkaman replied. "We got the 2 Dunnan Mackans, Bolide and Reliable." Then young Stephen of Ravery, who had been monitoring one of the intership screens, had a call from Captain Gompertz of the Grendelsbane, and at the same moment somebody else was yelling, "Here comes the Starhopper again." "Tell him to wait a moment, we have troubles," he said. Nemesis and Starhopper sledge-hammered each other and parried with counter-missiles, and then, quite unexpectedly, the Starhopper went to MC Square. There was an awful lot of them being converted to E off Marduk today, including Manfred Ravallo. That grieved him. Manfred was a good man and a good friend. He had a girl in Rivington, Niflheim. There were 800 good men aboard the Black Star, and most of them had girls who'd wait in vain for them on Tanith. Well, what had Edo Harkaman said so long ago on Graham? Something about old age not being a usual cause of death among Space Vikings, wasn't it? Then he remembered that Gompertz of the Grendelsbane was trying to get him. He told young Count Stephen to switch him over. "We just lost one of our Margicans," Gompertz told him in his staccato Beowulf accent. "I think she was the Challenger, the ship that got her looks like the... And I'm turning to engage her." "Which way?" "West around the planet." "Be right with you, Captain." It was like finishing a word puzzle. You sit staring at it, looking for more spaces to print letters into, and suddenly you realize that there are no more, that the puzzle is done. That was how the space battle of Marduk, the battle off Marduk, ended. Suddenly there were no more colored fire globes opening and fading, no more missiles coming, no more enemy ships to throw missiles at. Now it was time to take account of his own ships and then begin thinking about the battle on Marduk. The Black Star was gone. So was RMNS Challenger and RMNS Conquistador. Space Scourge was badly hammered, worse than after the Beowulf raid, Boke Valkenhayn said. The Vikings' gift was heavily damaged, too, and so was the Coruscant. And so, from the looks of the damage bore, was the Nemesis, and 3 ships were missing. The 3 independent Space Vikings, Harpy, Curse of Can, and Roger Fanmorval Etherson's damn thing. Prince Bentrick frowned over that. "I can't think that all 3 of those ships would have been destroyed without anybody seeing it happen." "Neither can I. But I can think that all those ships broke out of the battle together and headed in for the planet. They didn't come here to help liberate Marduk. They came here to fill their cargo holds. I only hope the people they're robbing all voted the Macken ticket in the last election." A crumb of comfort occurred to him, and he passed it on. "The only people who are armed to resist them will be Macken's stormtroops and Dunnan's pirates. They'll be the ones to get killed." "We don't want any more killing, then?" Prince Simon broke off suddenly. "I'm beginning to talk like His Late Highness." "Round Prince Edvard," he said. "He didn't want bloodshed either, and look whose blood was shed. If they're doing what you think they are, I'm afraid we'll have to kill a few of your Space Vikings, too." "They aren't my Space Vikings." He was a little surprised to find that, after almost 8 years of bearing the name himself, he was using it as an other people label. Well, why not? He was the ruler of the civilized planet of Tanith, and he... But let's not start fighting them till the main war's over. Those 3 shiploads are no worse than a bad cold. Mackan and Dunnan are the plague. It would still take 4 hours to get down in a spiral of deceleration. They started the telecasts, which had been filmed and taped on the voyage from Gimli. The Prince Protector Simon Bentrick spoke. The illegal rule of the traitor Mackan was ended. His deluded followers were advised to return to their allegiance to the crown. The people's watchmen were ordered to surrender their arms and disband. In localities where they refused, the loyal people were called upon to cooperate with the legitimate armed forces of the crown in exterminating them, and would be furnished arms as soon as possible. Little Princess Mina spoke. "If my grandfather is still alive, he is your king. If he is not, I am your queen, and until I'm old enough to rule in my own right, I accept Prince Simon as regent and protector of the realm, and I call on all of you to obey him as I will." "You didn't say anything about representative government or democracy or the Constitution," Trask mentioned. "And I noticed the use of the word rule instead of reign." "That's right," the self-proclaimed Prince Protector said. "There's something wrong with democracy. If there weren't, it could. And be overthrown by people like Mackan, attacking it from within by democratic procedures. I don't think it's fundamentally unworkable. I think it just has a few of what engineers call bugs. It's not safe to run a defective machine till you learn the defects and remedy them." "Well, I hope you don't think our sword world feudalism doesn't have bugs." He gave examples, and then quoted Otto Harkaman about Barbar. "Ism spreading downward from the top instead of upward from the bottom. It may just be," he added, "that there is something fundamentally unworkable about government itself. As long as Homo sapiens terra is a wild animal, which he has always been and always will be until he evolves into something different in 1 million or so years, Maybe a workable system of government is a political science impossibility, just as transmutation of elements was a physical science impossibility as long as they tried to do it by chemical means. Then we'll just have to make it work the best way we can, and when it breaks down, hope the next try will work a little better for a little longer, Bentrick said. Malverton grew in the telescopic screens as they came down. The Navy spaceport, where Trask had landed almost 2 years before, was in wreckage, sprinkled with damage. Ships that had been blasted on the ground and slagged by thermonuclear fires. There was fighting in the air all over the city proper, on building tops, on the ground, and in the air. That would be the damp thing harpy curse of Space Vikings. The royal palace was the center of one of half a dozen swirls of battle that had condensed out of the general skirmishing. Patrick Morland started for it with the first wave of ground fighters from the Nemesis. The Gilgamish freighter, like most of her ilk, had huge cargo ports all around. These began opening and disgorging a swarm of everything from landing craft and 100-foot airboats to one-man air cavalry single mounts. The top landing stages and terraces of the palace were almost obscured by the flashes of autocannon shells and the smoke and dust of projectiles. Then the first vehicles landed, the firing from the air stopped, and men fanned out as skirmishers, occasionally firing with small arms. Trask and Bentrick were in the armory off the vehicle bay, putting on combat equipment, when the 12-year-old Count of Ravry joined them and began rummaging for weapons and a helmet. "You're not going," his father told him. "I'll have enough to worry about taking care of myself." That was the wrong approach. Trask interrupted. "You're to stay aboard, Count," he said. As things stabilize, Princess Mina will have to come down. You'll act as her personal escort, and don't think you're being shoved into the background. She's crown princess, and if she isn't queen now, she will be in a few years. Escorting her now will be the foundation of your naval career. There isn't a young officer in the Royal Navy who wouldn't trade places with you." That was the right way to handle him, Lucas, Bentrick approved. After the boy had gone away, proud of his opportunity and his responsibility. "It'll do just what I said for him." He stopped for a moment to play with an idea that had just struck him. "You know, the girl will be queen in a few years if she isn't now. Queens need prince consorts. Your son's a good boy. I liked him the first moment I saw him, and I've liked him better ever since. He'd be a good man on the throne beside." "Queen Mina? Oh, that's out of the question. Not the matter of consanguinity, they're about a 16th cousin, but people would say I was abusing the protectorship to marry my son onto the throne. Simon, speaking as one sovereign prince to another, you have a lot to learn. You've learned one important lesson already, that a ruler must be willing to use force and shed blood to enforce his rule. You have to learn, too, that a ruler and not afford to be guided by his fears of what people will say about him, not even what history will say about him. A ruler's only judge is himself." Bentrick slid the transpex visor of his helmet up and down experimentally, checked the chambers of his pistol and carbine. "All that matters to me is the peace and well-being of Marduk. I'll have to talk it over with my only judge. Well, let's go." The top terrace is worse. A cure when their car landed. More vehicles were coming down and discharging men. A swarm of landing craft were sinking past the building toward the ground 2,000 feet below. Auto weapons and small arms and light cannon banged, and bombs and recoilless rifle shells crashed on the lower terraces. They put the car down one of the shaftways until they ran into heavy fire from below, at the limit of the advance, and then turned into a odd hallway, floating high enough to clear the heads of the men on foot. It looked like the part of the palace where he had lodged when he had been a guest there, but it probably wasn't. They came to hastily constructed barricades of furniture and statuary and furnishings, behind which Macken's People's Watchmen and Andray Dunnan's Space Vikings were making resistance. They entered rooms dusty with powdered plaster and acrid with powder fumes, littered with corpses. They passed lifter skids being towed out with wounded. They went through rooms crowded with their own men. "Keep your fingers off things. This isn't a looting expedition." "You stupid cretin, how did you know there wasn't a man hiding behind that?" In one huge room, ballroom or concert room or something, there were prisoners herded, and men from the Nemesis were setting up polyencephalographic veridicators, sturdy chairs, with wires and adjustable helmets and translucent globes mounted over them. A couple of Moreland's men were hustling a people's watchman to one and strapping him into a chair. "You know what this is, don't you?" one of them was saying. "This is a veridicator, that global light blue. The moment you try to lie to us, it'll turn red. And the moment it turns red, I'm going to hammer your teeth down your throat with the butt of this pistol." "Have you found anything out about the king yet?" Bentrick asked him. He turned. "No, nobody we've questioned so far knows anything later than a month ago about him. He just disappeared." He was going to say something else, saw Bentrick's face, and changed his mind. "He's dead," Bentrick said dully. "They tortured him and brainwashed him and used him as a ventriloquist's dummy on the screen as long as they could. When they couldn't let the people see him anymore, they stuffed him into a converter. They did find Zaspar Macken, hours later. Maybe he could have told them something if he had been alive, but he and a few of his fanatical followers had barricaded themselves in the throne room and died trying to defend it. They found Macken on the throne, the top of his head blown away, a pistol death-gripped in his hand, and the great crown lying on the floor, the velvy. Inner cap bullet-pierced and splattered with blood and brain tissue. Prince Bentrick picked it up and looked at it disgustedly. "We'll have to have something done about that," he said. "I really didn't think he'd do just this. I thought he wanted to abolish the throne, not sit on it. Except for one chandelier smashed and several corpses that had to be dragged out, the ministerial council room was intact. They set up headquarters there. Bokva. Ulkenhain and several other ship captains joined them. There was fighting going on in several places inside the palace, and the city was still in a turmoil. Somebody managed to get in touch with the captains of the damn thing, the Harpy and the Curse of Can, and bring them to the palace. Trask attempted to reason with them to no avail. "Prince Trask, you're my friend, and you've always dealt fairly with me," Roger Van Morville Esterson said. "But you know just how far any Space Viking captain can control his crew. These men didn't come here to correct the political mistakes of Marduk. They came here for what they could haul away. I could get myself killed trying to stop them now." "I wouldn't even try," the captain of the Curse of Can put in. "I came here for what I could make out of this planet myself." "You can try to stop them," said the captain of the Harpy. "You'll find it even harder than what you're doing now." Trask looked at some of the reports that had come in from elsewhere on the planet. Harkaman had landed on one of the big cities to the east, and the people had risen against Macken's local bosses, and were helping wipe out the people's watchmen with arms they had been furnished. Valkenhain's exec had landed on a large concentration camp, where close to 10,000 of Macken's political enemies had been. And he had distributed all his available weapons and was calling for more. Gompertz of the Grendelsbane was at Dreplin. He reported just the reverse. The people there had risen in support of the Macken regime, and he wanted authorization to use nuclear weapons against them. "Could you talk your people into going to some other city?" Trask asked. "We have a city for you, big industrial center. It ought to be fine looting." "Dreplin. The people there are Margican subjects, too," Bentrick began. Then he shrugged. "It's not what we'd like to do, it's what we have to. By all means, gentlemen, take your men to Dreplin, and nobody will object to anything you do. And when you have that place looted out, try Abaddon. You were aground there, Captain Estherson. You know what all done and left there. Couple of Space Vikings, no Royal Army of Tanith men brought it. The old woman dirty in rags, almost exhausted. She wants to talk to Prince Bentrick, won't talk to anybody else, says she knows where the king is." Bentrick rose quickly, brought her to a chair, poured a glass of wine for her. "He's still alive, Your Highness. The Crown Princess Melanie and I'm sorry, Your Highness, Dowager Crown Princess, have been taking care of him the best way we could. If you'll only come quickly." Mikhill. Roman 8, planetary king of Marduk, lay on a pallet of filthy bedding on the floor of a narrow room behind a mass-energy converter which disposed of the rubbish and sewage and generated power for some of the fixed equipment on one of the middle floors of the east wing of the palace. There was a bucket of water, and on a rough wooden bench lay a cloth-wrapped bundle of food. A woman, haggard and disheveled, wearing a suit of greasy mechanics. Overalls and nothing else squatted beside him. The Crown Princess Melanie, whom Trask remembered as the charming and gracious hostess of Cragdale. She tried to rise and staggered. "Prince Bentrick, and it's Prince Trask of Tanith," she cried. "Just hurry, get him out of here and to where he can be taken care of, please." Then she sat down again on the floor and fell over unconscious. They couldn't get the story. The Princess Melanie had collapsed completely. Her companion, another noblewoman of the court, could only ramble disconnectedly. And the king merely lay, bathed and fed in a clean bed, and looked up at them wonderingly, as though nothing he saw or heard conveyed any meaning to him. The doctors could do nothing. He has no mind, no more mind than a newborn baby. We can keep him alive, I don't know how long. That's our professional duty, but it's no kindness. To His Majesty. The little pockets of resistance in the palace were wiped out through the next morning and afternoon, all but one far underground below the main power plant. They tried sleep gas, the defenders had blowers and sent it back at them. They tried blasting. There was a limit to what the fabric of the building would stand. And nobody knew how long it would take to starve them out. On the third day, a man crawled out, pushing a white ship. Tied to the barrel of a carbine ahead of him. "Is Prince Lucas Trask of Tanith here?" he asked. "I won't speak to anybody else." They brought Trask quickly. All that was visible of the other man was the carbine barrel and the white shirt. When Trask called to him, he raised his head above the rubble behind which he was hiding. "Prince Trask, we have Andray Dunnan here. He was leading us, but now we've disarmed him and are holding him. If we turn him over to you, will you let us go? If you all come out unarmed and bring Dunnan with you, I promise you the rest of you will be let outside this building and allowed to go away unharmed." "All right, we'll be coming out in a minute." The man raised his voice. "It's agreed," he called. "Bring him out." There were fewer than 200 of them. Some wore the uniforms of high officers of the People's Watchmen or of PIPA. Welfare Party functionaries. A few wore the heavily braided short jackets of Space Viking officers. Among them, they propelled a thin-faced man with a pointed beard, and Trask had to look twice at him before he recognized the face of Andray Dunnan. It looked more like the face of Duke Angus of Wardshaven as he last remembered it. Dunnan looked at him in incurious contempt. "Your dotard king couldn't rule without Zaspar Makan. And Makan couldn't rule without me, and neither can you," he said. "Shoot this gang of turncoats, and I'll rule Marduk for you." He looked at Trask again. "Who are you?" he demanded. "I don't know you." Trask slipped the pistol from his holster, thumbing off the safety. "I am Lucas Trask. You've heard that name before," he said. "Stand away from behind him, you people." "Oh, yes, the poor fool who thought he was going to marry Elaine." "Karvall? Well, you won't, Lord Trask of Traskin. She loves me, not you. She's waiting for me now on Graham." Trask shot him through the head. Dunnan's eyes widened in momentary incredulity, then his knees gave way and he fell forward on his face. Trask thumbed on the safety and holstered the pistol and looked at the body on the concrete. It hadn't made the least difference. It had been like shooting a snake or one of the nasty Corpian things that infested the old buildings in Rivington. Just no more Andray Dunnan. "Take that carrion and stuff it in a mass-energy converter," he said. "And I don't want anybody to mention the name of Andray Dunnan to me again." He didn't look at them haul Dunnan's body away on a lifter skid. He watched the 50-odd leaders of the overthrown misgovernment of Marduk shamble away to freedom, guarded by Patrick Morland's rye. Flamen. Now there was something to reproach himself for. He'd committed a separate and distinct crime against Marduk by letting each one of them live. Unless recognized and killed by somebody outside, every one of them would be at some villainy before next sunrise. Well, King Simon, I could cope with that. He started when he realized how he had thought of his friend. Well, why not? Mikhil's mind was dead. His body would not survive. It more than a year. Then a child queen and a long regency, and long regencies were dangerous. Better a strong king in name as well as power, and the succession could be safeguarded by marrying Stephen and Minna. Minna had accepted at 8 that she must someday marry for reasons of state. Why not her playmate Stephen, and Simon Bentrick would see the necessity. He was neither a fool nor a moral coward. He only needed to take some time to adjust to ideas. The rabble who had bought their lives with their leaders had gone now. Slowly he followed them, thinking, don't press the idea on Simon too hard, just expose him to it and let him adopt it. And there would be the treaty, Tanith, Marduk, Beowulf, Amaterasu, eventually, treaties with the other civilized planets. Nebulously, the idea of a league of civilized worlds began to take shape in his mind. It'd be a good idea if he adopted the title of King of Tanith for himself, and cut loose from the sword worlds, especially cut loose from Graham. Let Victor of Xochitl have it, or Garvan Spasso. Victor wouldn't be the last Space Viking to take his ships back against the Sword Worlds. Sooner or later, civilization in the old Federation would drive them all home to loot the planets that had sent them out. Well, if he was going. Be a king, shouldn't he have a queen? Kings usually did. He climbed into the little hull car and started up a long shaft. There was Valerie Alvarath. They'd enjoyed each other's society on the Nemesis. He wondered if she would want to make it permanent, even on a throne. Elaine was with him. He felt her beside him, almost tangibly. Her voice was whispering to him. She loves you, Lucas. She'll say yes, be good to her, and she'll may. You happy? Then she was gone, and he knew that she would never return. Goodbye, Elaine.